Tonight, let me whisper you the history of ancient civilizations. A story carried by the tides of time, where the echoes of vanished empires still rest beneath quiet stars. Before we begin, tell me from which part of the world you are listening, whether from distant coasts, quiet valleys, or the heart of bustling cities. Wherever you are, may this history settle softly around you, like a gentle blanket of memory. More than 3,000 years ago, the lands that bordered the Mediterranean Sea thrived in a rare harmony. Egypt's fertile Nile Valley gave rise to harvests and monuments of enduring grandeur. To the north, the Hittites commanded the Anatolian highlands, while Mycenaean kings ruled their strongholds in Greece. Along the coast of Syria, Ugarit flourished as a hub of trade, bridging east and west. This was the Late Bronze Age, a time not only of kings and warriors, but also of merchants, scribes, and artisans. Across the seas, ships carried copper, tin, ivory, and grain. Caravans brought textiles, oils, and exotic goods. These networks created a web of connection, allowing empires to prosper together, each part reliant on the other. It was a golden balance of necessity and trust. In Egypt, the pharaohs stood as divine rulers, their authority affirmed by temples rising above the Nile. They traded not only for wealth, but for stability, ensuring that grain flowed outward to other kingdoms. Hieroglyphs etched on walls spoke of triumphs and ceremonies, but hidden within them was another truth: the careful management of resources in a world woven tightly by trade. Further north, the Hittites built their capital at Hattusa, a city carved from stone, ringed with massive gates. They were masters of chariot warfare, yet also diplomats who signed treaties with neighboring powers. Their archives recorded letters exchanged with Egypt and Babylon, proving that these empires did not stand alone, but were bound by correspondence, gifts, and mutual recognition. Across the Aegean, the Mycenaeans rose in their fortified palaces. Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos. Their architecture displayed strength, while their art carried echoes of Minoan grace. They sent their ships across the seas, trading pottery, metals, and ideas. In their halls, scribes pressed symbols into clay tablets using the script we call Linear B, recording inventories of sheep, oil, and bronze. The coastal city of Ugarit, smaller than the vast empires, thrived as a crossroads of cultures. Its merchants carried letters in multiple languages, speaking with Hittites, Egyptians, and Cypriots alike. Clay tablets from its libraries reveal a society of complexity. Legal codes, trade agreements, even hymns to gods who watched over the city. Ugarit was a jewel of interconnection. Cyprus, rich in copper, became essential to the Bronze Age economy. Its mines supplied the vital metal that, mixed with tin, forged the tools and weapons of the age. Without Cyprus, the system could not function. Merchant fleets came to its harbors, exchanging grain and goods for the ore that sustained armies and artisans across the Mediterranean world. To the east, Babylonia and Assyria nurtured traditions of law, mathematics, and astronomy. Though distant, they joined the great exchange of goods and knowledge. Their scribes observed the skies, tracking the rhythms of stars and planets, which would later echo through centuries of human thought. Each kingdom added a piece to the tapestry of the age. It was an era when writing flourished. Egyptian hieroglyphs, Hittite cuneiform, and Ugaritic alphabets coexisted, carrying records across lands and seas. The written word was not yet universal, but it served as a bridge between courts, ensuring that kings could speak across hundreds of miles without ever meeting face to face. Diplomacy thrived in clay and ink. Trade was the lifeblood, but it was also fragile. Ships relied on steady winds and safe harbors. Caravans moved slowly across dangerous routes. Yet when conditions held, the system enriched all. A palace in Greece could contain goods from Egypt, while a Hittite temple might hold jewelry crafted with Mycenaean design. Every artifact was a story of connection. This world, though ancient, shared qualities we might recognize today. Interdependence created stability, but also vulnerability. Each empire stood strong, yet none was entirely alone. The fall of one could ripple across the network, disturbing the balance. For now, however, the system shimmered with prosperity, its people unaware of the shadows slowly gathering. In villages and towns, ordinary lives followed the rhythm of the seasons. Farmers sowed grain, shepherds tended flocks, and craftsmen shaped pottery for markets that reached far beyond their borders. Though kings wrote letters and armies stood ready, it was these daily lives that truly sustained the grandeur of empires. Their quiet persistence made the system possible. Religions added meaning to the cycles of life. Egyptians worshipped deities like Amun and Ra, while the Hittites honored storm gods upon high mountains. The Mycenaeans called upon Zeus and Hera, their names etched in early form on clay. These beliefs offered comfort, structure, and legitimacy, weaving spiritual threads through the political tapestry. In ports like Byblos and Ugarit/1 might have heard a dozen languages spoken in the same marketplace. Sailors from Cyprus bargained with traders from Egypt. Merchants from Anatolia exchanged news with emissaries from distant lands. Such encounters not only spread goods, but also songs, stories, and customs, blending cultures at the edges of every transaction. The palaces of the age were more than homes for rulers. They were centers of administration. Records of grain storage, taxes, and offerings were carefully maintained. These archives show us a world of meticulous planning, a system where resources were calculated to ensure that abundance continued and scarcity was minimized. It was civilization as balance and foresight. Beyond the palaces, the natural world shaped destiny. The Nile's flooding nourished Egypt, while the Anatolian highlands demanded careful farming. Storms, earthquakes, and droughts were constant reminders of fragility. Yet for centuries, people adapted, learned, and endured, shaping their lives in rhythm with the unpredictable moods of earth and sky. The late Bronze Age can feel distant, yet its echoes are close. When we study the fragments of letters, the remains of pottery, or the outlines of fortresses, we are seeing the remnants of human intention, of people who loved, feared, and hoped. Their achievements remind us that history is not only about kings, but about communities working together. The system allowed for art as well as survival. Frescoes adorned palace walls, depicting ships at sea, dancers in ritual, and animals from distant lands. Jewelry carried intricate patterns, crafted by hands that had mastered their tools. Even weapons, though made for conflict, displayed artistry. Beauty and utility walked hand in hand. Music and poetry were part of this world too. Though the melodies are lost, texts suggest songs accompanied rituals, harvests, and voyages. Oral traditions passed stories from generation to generation, preserving myth and memory in voices that drifted over fields and seas. These were the quiet companions of empire, softer than stone but just as enduring. In this high point of civilization, knowledge itself was traded. Medical texts, omen interpretations, and recipes for dyes or perfumes moved from one culture to another. Every exchange enriched the collective wisdom of the region. showing that learning, like copper or grain, could be a form of wealth. Yet even as empires prospered, they faced pressures at their edges. Nomadic groups watched the settled lands with curiosity and desire. The seas carried not only merchants, but raiders. For the moment, strong walls and powerful fleets held them at bay, and the world within continued to glow with apparent stability. The letters preserved in archives reveal a tone of both confidence and dependency. Kings addressed one another as brothers, exchanging daughters in marriage and gifts of gold. Yet beneath the surface, each acknowledged their reliance on the other. It was a world of careful diplomacy, where balance meant survival. To imagine this age is to picture a web stretched across continents, delicate yet resilient. From the banks of the Nile to the hills of Greece, from the harbors of Cyprus to the palaces of Anatolia, humanity created a shared rhythm. For centuries it held strong, a testimony to cooperation and ambition. As we rest in this first chapter of the story, let us hold the image of a world at its height, vibrant, connected, and unaware of the trials that lay ahead. The seas were calm, the harvests rich, and the empires mighty. Tonight, their voices whisper to us from the ruins, offering a gentle reminder of how high human civilization once soared. History for sleep often drifts into moments where stillness hides uncertainty. In the late Bronze Age, beneath the surface of prosperity, small tremors of unease rippled through great kingdoms. These were not yet disasters, only whispers, signs easy to miss, like faint cracks in a grand mural. The people of the age carried on, unaware that these subtle disturbances were the first notes of a deeper change. In the fields, farmers sometimes found their crops failing, as rains did not always come as expected. Grain was life, and even a modest shortage rippled outward, affecting taxes, trade, and food for armies. When harvests weakened, palaces felt the strain. Temples relied on offerings that grew lighter each season, and common households bore the greatest burden in silence. Earthquakes, sudden and unpredictable, shook the Aegean and Anatolia. Stone walls cracked, and temples shifted on their foundations. To us, these tremors appear as isolated events, but to ancient minds, they were warnings from the gods. Fear traveled with every aftershock, reminding communities that no wall was unbreakable, no city eternal. Along the coastlines, shifting trade winds sometimes delayed ships or scattered fleets across dangerous waters. Harbors that once bustled with steady rhythm could fall quiet for weeks. With fewer ships, fewer goods arrived, and the balance that bound kingdoms together thinned. What seemed like chance weather could easily unsettle the delicate fabric of international trust. Diplomatic letters from this age carry a trace of anxiety. Kings who once traded gifts with warmth began to press one another for supplies. "Send grain," one letter pleads, "for my people are hungry." Such requests, carved into clay, suggest not just friendship but dependence. When supplies faltered, suspicion grew, and bonds that had seemed eternal loosened. On the fringes of empires, nomadic groups wandered, searching for pastures and stability. The strength of great kingdoms kept them at bay, but even the strongest walls could not prevent movement forever. Pressures at the edges were building quietly, like water behind a dam, unnoticed until the weight grew too great. In Anatolia, the Hittites faced not only the demands of empire, but also the challenge of internal conflict. Rival lords pressed against the authority of the king, and shifting alliances strained their unity. Hattusa still rose in majesty, yet the confidence of earlier centuries no longer glowed as brightly. Power, though vast, carried threads of fragility. The Mycenaean palaces, too, were not untouched by unease. Archaeology reveals signs of fortification. Walls built higher, gates reinforced, as if kings sensed danger on the horizon. To strengthen defenses was to admit a fear that peace might not endure. Within the walls, life continued, but outside, the world grew more uncertain. In Egypt, the great pharaohs of the New Kingdom faced challenges, not from a single enemy, but from a combination of strain. Maintaining far-off territories required soldiers, supplies, and gold. Yet when shortages came, the cost of empire became heavier. Inscriptions show victories, but victories demanded endless resources, which even the Nile could not always provide. The city of Ugarit, bright with trade, recorded letters that reveal a society anxious about its future. Messages arrive reporting hostile ships sighted at sea. The tone is cautious, edged with fear. For a city that depended on safe harbors, even rumors of raiders were enough to shake its confidence. Whispers of unrest were not only physical but also spiritual. When disasters struck, whether drought, quake, or famine, people turned to their gods for explanation. If the offerings failed, perhaps the gods had grown displeased. Temples sought larger sacrifices, and priests spoke louder of duty, for faith itself could fray in uncertain times. The interconnectedness of the late Bronze Age, once a strength, became a source of risk. When one region suffered, others soon felt the strain. A shortage of copper in Cyprus could weaken weapons in Greece. A poor harvest in Anatolia could reduce trade for Egypt. Each link carried weight, and each failure echoed across the network. Ordinary people must have sensed these shifts in their own lives. Markets that once brimmed with imported goods might have offered less. Travel grew more dangerous as roads became less secure. Stories of hardship likely spread from village to village, carried on the lips of merchants who spoke of distant troubles in foreign lands. The fragile balance of diplomacy began to tilt. The careful language of kings calling one another brother and friend grew sharper when resources faltered. Promises of loyalty could turn hollow when hunger pressed. Beneath the polite words of clay tablets, there is the unmistakable tone of unease. Archaeologists studying these times often find layers of destruction intermingled with rebuilding. A town might burn, only to rise again within a generation, suggesting repeated disruptions. Life went on, but with greater strain. Each rebuilding required more effort, leaving less strength to withstand the next blow. Trade caravans, once steady, sometimes arrived late or not at all. Banditry may have grown on the roads, emboldened by weakened defenses. Merchants, who thrived in stable times, now faced risks that could turn profit into loss overnight. The hum of safe commerce grew strained, like a song sung off-key. In the Aegean, pottery styles shifted, reflecting not only artistic tastes but also supply. When imported designs grew scarce, local artisans filled the gap. Such changes may seem small, but they suggest that international exchange was faltering, and communities had to adjust, piecing together beauty from what remained within reach. Legends, later preserved by the Greeks, hint at unrest and wandering. Tales of heroes traveling far, of cities in turmoil, may hold echoes of these centuries. While myth transforms history, it often carries a kernel of memory, a reflection of instability that storytellers could not ignore. Even as cracks appeared, most people did not imagine collapse. History rarely feels fragile to those living it. Farmers still sowed fields, scribes still recorded taxes, and priests still prayed at altars. Life continued with an air of normalcy, even as the foundation beneath trembled softly. Small signs, however, can grow into great changes. A delayed shipment of grain could spark unrest. A missed harvest could fuel migration. A weakened army could tempt raiders. In the complexity of the late Bronze Age, every thread was connected, and when threads frayed, the entire fabric risked unraveling. Natural forces joined human struggles. Periods of drought have been detected in climate records from this era, suggesting the earth itself withheld water. With crops failing, herds thinning, and streams running low, societies turned inward, rationing resources and questioning the stability they had once trusted. Seas that once united also carried danger. Ships no longer brought only traders, but strangers whose intentions were unclear. Were they merchants, migrants, or raiders? The uncertainty itself was unsettling, for the sight of sails on the horizon could inspire either hope or fear, and the difference was not always known until too late. Though whispers of unrest did not yet bring collapse, they built an atmosphere of tension. Letters from rulers and fragments of ruins together paint the picture of societies stretched thin. Prosperity remained, but it stood on foundations less steady than they had once believed. This period of unease was the prelude to transformation. The signs, faint but persistent, remind us that civilizations rarely fall in silence. They shift, weaken, and warn, leaving clues that later generations can trace. The late Bronze Age was listening to its own warnings, though not all could understand their meaning. As the empires of the Mediterranean carried on with their rituals and routines, the whispers grew louder, though still faint to those who lived them. From trembling earth to failing harvests, from strained diplomacy to restless borders, the stage was quietly set. Soon the shadows would lengthen, and the sea peoples would emerge from mystery into history. The first signs of the sea peoples appear like faint outlines in a fading fresco, visible but never fully clear. Ancient records speak of strangers arriving by sea, their names shifting from one tablet to another. To those who lived along the Mediterranean coasts, these newcomers were unsettling presences, unfamiliar in dress, language, and intent. Egyptian texts describe encounters with groups whose origins were unknown. Some came in ships, their prows decorated with bird-like carvings. Others appeared as wandering families with carts, seeking land to settle. Were they warriors, refugees, or both? To the people of the late Bronze Age, the difference was often blurred by fear and need. Inscriptions from Pharaoh Meneptah mention battles against invaders from the sea. The words are carved in stone, triumphant in tone, yet their very existence reveals concern. If these groups had been minor raiders, they might not have been recorded. That they were remembered suggests their impact was felt deeply, even in mighty Egypt. Archaeological evidence offers further whispers. In coastal cities like Ugarit, letters survive describing ships sighted offshore, hostile and threatening. The language of the scribes is anxious. Warnings sent to kings, pleas for assistance, reports of destruction. Such fragments are fragile voices, yet they reveal the fear of watching sails gather on the horizon. The names given to these peoples vary: Shurdan, Shekelesh, Peleset, Luca. Each appears in Egyptian records, though it is unclear whether they were single tribes or shifting alliances. What unites them in the texts is their origin from the sea, a reminder that water, once a medium of trade, could also deliver danger. Some theories suggest these groups were displaced populations, forced from their homelands by famine, drought, or war. The Aegean, Anatolia, and beyond may have seen communities collapse, driving families to the coasts in search of survival. two neighboring kingdoms. However, the arrival of desperate strangers could easily feel like invasion. Egyptian reliefs show the sea peoples with distinctive helmets and round shields, their garments different from Egyptian soldiers. Such images freeze them in stylized poses of conflict, yet behind the art may lie real encounters. Each carved figure represents a person who crossed seas, driven by forces we can only partly imagine. The uncertainty of their identity is part of their enduring mystery. Were they united under a single banner, or were they simply diverse groups lumped together by those who faced them? The evidence suggests fluidity. Shifting bands of migrants, sometimes mercenaries, sometimes raiders, sometimes settlers. One letter from Ugarit describes enemies attacking from the sea. The king, desperate, pleads for help. No aid arrived in time. Soon after, the city fell, its palaces burned, its archives buried in ash. These letters, never read by their intended recipients, now speak only to us, across millennia. The very phrase "sea peoples" was born not in their own voices, but in the records of others. They left no written language of their own that survives. What we know of them comes filtered through fear, conflict, and survival, pieced together by the civilizations that resisted their arrival. It is possible that not all encounters were hostile. Some may have settled peacefully, working as farmers or serving as soldiers for hire. Ancient empires often absorbed outsiders into their ranks. Yet when numbers grew too large, or when resources were too scarce, the balance could tip, and peace turned to tension. Imagine the uncertainty of coastal towns. Fishermen spotting unknown ships on the horizon. Merchants unsure whether to expect trade or plunder. The sea, once a path of opportunity, now carried the threat of strangers who might arrive armed and hungry, demanding what could not always be given. The sea peoples remind us of how migration and conflict intertwine. For the settled kingdoms, they were invaders. For themselves, perhaps, they were survivors of collapse elsewhere, carrying families, traditions, and the hope of a new beginning. Two perspectives collided on the same shores, and history preserved only one clearly. Egyptian texts present their victories as decisive, yet the repeated mention of these groups suggests otherwise. They returned again and again, not easily defeated, their presence lingering across decades. Like the tides, they ebbed and flowed, a recurring force that tested the resilience of empires. In later centuries, some of these groups may have found permanent homes. The Peleset, for instance, are often linked to the Philistines of the Hebrew Bible, who settled in the coastal plains of Canaan. If true, this suggests that even as raiders, they also became founders of new societies. The fragmentary nature of the evidence leaves room for interpretation. Some scholars imagine them as pirates exploiting chaos. Others see climate refugees seeking stability. Both may hold truth. The sea peoples were not a single story, but many, their roles shifting as they moved from shore to shore. To the Hittites, already strained by internal conflict and famine, the arrival of these groups may have been catastrophic. Records of Hattusa grow silent near the time of their raids. Whether they struck directly or indirectly, the Hittite Empire fell, and its lands were left open for others to claim. In Greece, the collapse of Mycenaean palaces coincides with this age of movement. Whether the sea peoples contributed directly or merely reflected wider turmoil, their presence belongs to the larger storm that reshaped the eastern Mediterranean. The fall of one kingdom echoed into the struggles of its neighbors. Archaeological ruins bear the scars of their passing. Burned cities, toppled walls, abandoned harbors, all suggest violence, but also migration. Where destruction ended, settlement sometimes began. New pottery styles, new tools, and new customs appear, blending with local traditions. Out of unrest came transformation. To imagine their journeys is to picture families on the move. Ships crowded with supplies, carts creaking over land, children carried in arms. Survival may have driven them farther than they ever expected, guided only by the hope of reaching safer shores. Behind the terror they inspired lay the human face of displacement. Their mystery endures, because they occupy the space between history and legend. With no single homeland, no written chronicles, they seem like figures adrift, shadows moving between the ruins of one world and the birth of another. The silence they left behind makes them all the more haunting. The Sea Peoples also remind us that history is rarely one-sided. The accounts we have come from the victors, who shaped the story in stone and clay, yet the full truth lies somewhere between, both raider and refugee, both destroyer and settler, both feared enemy and future ancestor. Their emergence marks a turning point in the Bronze Age, where once seas connected thriving networks, they now carried disruption. The arrival of the Sea Peoples signaled that the balance was breaking, and the age of interwoven empires was giving way to a harsher, more uncertain era. Even today, we cannot say with certainty who they were, but perhaps that is their quiet power, to remain an enigma, a reminder of how fragile civilizations can be, and how easily outsiders can reshape the destiny of the mighty. Their shadows still drift across the pages of history. As the Sea Peoples appeared in the records of kings and the ruins of cities, the whispers of unrest grew louder, turning into the first rumblings of collapse. Soon, battles would spread, and flames would rise from once stable palaces. The tide of history was shifting, and the world of the late Bronze Age stood at the edge of change. Among all the kingdoms of the late Bronze Age, Egypt left the most vivid accounts of meeting the Sea Peoples. Their hieroglyphs and carved reliefs allow us to see the encounters, not only as battles, but as stories told from the perspective of pharaohs who claimed divine protection. The inscriptions, bold and deliberate, transformed conflict into a stage where Egypt's strength was reaffirmed. Pharaoh Meneptah, son of the famous Ramesses II, recorded victories against groups identified as Libyans and Sea Peoples. The inscriptions on his stela describe invaders defeated and lands secured. Yet the very need to carve such declarations suggests that Egypt felt the threat was real and pressing. For a land accustomed to stability, the arrival of foreign raiders was deeply unsettling. Later, during the reign of Ramesses III, the encounters became even more dramatic. Reliefs at Medinet Habu, his mortuary temple near Thebes, depict longships crowded with warriors, their prows ornamented, their crews locked in battle with Egyptian forces. These images are among the most detailed depictions of naval warfare from the ancient world. The reliefs show the Sea Peoples with distinctive feathered headdresses and round shields, their families following in ox-drawn carts. This suggests migration as much as invasion. Egypt presented the conflict as a glorious victory, but the evidence carved into stone acknowledges that entire communities were on the move, bringing women and children as well as warriors. Inscriptions describe Egypt preparing carefully for the onslaught. Fortifications were strengthened along the Nile Delta. Soldiers, archers, and ships stood ready. Ramesses III claimed that the Sea Peoples came from the Isles, sweeping across lands before reaching Egypt. His triumph was cast as the last defense of civilization against chaos. The battles were not only on land but also at sea. Reliefs show Egyptian archers firing from the decks of ships, while enemy vessels tilt and break under attack. In the water, combatants struggle, some sinking beneath the waves. It is a rare and haunting glimpse of the terror of ancient naval battle, frozen in stone but once alive with cries and chaos. Despite the triumphal tone, Egypt's survival came at a cost. The wars strained resources and manpower. Victories brought glory, but maintaining defenses demanded grain, soldiers, and wealth. The encounters with the Sea Peoples marked a turning point. Egypt could repel them, but the effort revealed limits that even mighty pharaohs could not ignore. The Medinet Habu inscriptions describe how entire coalitions of Sea Peoples advanced together, unlike small bands of raiders. This gave the impression of a massive movement, a wave that engulfed lands before breaking on Egypt's shores. The pharaoh's boast of victory reflects pride, but also relief that the kingdom held its ground when others fell. The Egyptians named these groups Peliset, Jekka, Shurdan, and more. Each carried its own identity, though whether these names represented tribes, confederations, or simply labels imposed by Egypt remains uncertain. In the reliefs, however, they are united, marching together as one threat, reinforcing the drama of Egypt's confrontation. Ramesses III emphasized divine favor in his victory. The gods, he proclaimed, stood beside him, ensuring the Sea Peoples would fail. To the Egyptian mind, such battles were not only political or military, but cosmic. Order triumphing over chaos. The eternal cycle of Mat preserved through Pharaoh's strength. The depiction of the Sea Peoples also served as a warning. By portraying them vividly, Egypt etched their threat into cultural memory. Generations to come could look upon the reliefs and see the dangers of outsiders, and the triumph of Egypt as a beacon of stability. History was sculpted into lessons of endurance. For modern historians, these reliefs provide rare details about weaponry and tactics. We see long spears, bows, and distinctive helmets. Ships with high sterns face off in close quarters. Such imagery reveals how naval warfare was imagined and perhaps experienced in the Bronze Age, a glimpse otherwise lost to time. Yet, the victory was not absolute. While Egypt survived, other kingdoms did not. The fall of Ugarit, the collapse of Hatti, and the weakening of Mycenaean Greece, show that the Sea Peoples movement reshaped the region even if Egypt held its borders. Survival was not the same as immunity. The reliefs also suggest that Egypt absorbed some of these peoples into its society. Captives may have been settled in frontier lands, used as laborers or soldiers. What began as invasion ended as integration, showing that migration could not be wholly resisted. It reshaped the kingdom even in victory. The Nile Delta became the focal point of this struggle. Its marshy terrain favored defenders who knew the waterways. Egyptian ships could maneuver with precision, while attackers struggled in unfamiliar channels. Geography, as much as strength, helped Egypt hold its ground against the incoming tide. The triumphs of Ramesses III mark one of the last great displays of New Kingdom power. The pharaoh preserved Egypt's borders and legacy, but beneath the victory lay exhaustion. Resources stretched thin, and in later years, internal challenges grew harder to contain. The encounters with the Sea Peoples were both a climax and a warning. The inscriptions emphasize glory, yet subtle hints of strain remain. Grain shipments, military provisions, and temple donations reveal the immense cost of defense. Egypt could project strength, but it could not escape the weight of maintaining empire in an increasingly unstable world. The memory of the Sea Peoples lingered long after the battles ended. Egyptian scribes preserved the names, images, and stories, ensuring they remained part of the cultural landscape. To Egyptians, they symbolized both a threat overcome and a reminder of the vulnerability that came with greatness. For archaeologists, these records are invaluable. Without them, the Sea Peoples might have remained invisible, known only through the silence of destroyed cities. Egypt, by recording its struggles, gave us the rare chance to glimpse the faces of an otherwise elusive chapter in human history. The Sea Peoples' arrival in Egypt represents a meeting point between two worlds: the stable, enduring civilization of the Nile and the restless, migrating groups carried by the sea. In their clash, we see the fragility of borders and the inevitability of movement, themes that resonate across history. Ramesses III stood as a guardian at the threshold of collapse. His victories preserved Egypt while neighbors fell, allowing the kingdom to continue for centuries. Yet, Egypt was changed. It had seen the edge of chaos, and though it did not fall, it would never again stand untouched by the tides of migration and war. For the people of Egypt, these battles must have been frightening. Families living near the delta would have heard of ships gathering, of foreign armies approaching. Though the inscriptions declare victory, ordinary lives were marked by fear, uncertainty, and the memory of how close danger had come. The Sea Peoples may not have conquered Egypt, but they altered its destiny. The resources spent in defense weakened the kingdom's ability to expand or project power. In time, Egypt turned inward, becoming less a great empire and more a regional power. Survival came, but at the cost of ambition. In the quiet of Medinet Habu today, the reliefs remain, their carved lines still sharp under the desert sun. Visitors can stand before them and see the ships, the warriors, the archers, frozen in eternal combat. The stones whisper both pride and caution, echoing the drama of a world once trembling at its edges. Egypt's encounter with the Sea Peoples was not merely a battle but a defining moment. It revealed resilience, but also fragility. It preserved a civilization, yet foreshadowed decline. In the calm of night, their story reminds us that even the mightiest kingdoms must face the unexpected, and that survival often leaves scars as deep as defeat. Across the Mediterranean, ruins bear silent witness to a time when once thriving cities fell into fire and silence. Archaeology uncovers blackened walls, collapsed roofs, and layers of ash, each speaking of sudden violence. The fall of these cities was not the work of centuries, but of days or even hours, when life was interrupted and never fully restored. One of the most haunting examples is the city of Ugarit, a jewel of the Syrian coast. Its archives preserve desperate letters sent to allies, reporting hostile ships off its shores. These pleas were never answered. Before help could arrive, Ugarit was engulfed in flames. When excavators uncovered the city centuries later, tablets lay where scribes had left them, frozen in time. In Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, the evidence is equally stark. The once grand citadel, surrounded by walls and lion-shaped gates, fell silent. Palaces were abandoned, temples left empty. The archives that once held thousands of clay tablets ceased to record. What had been a great empire was reduced to scattered fragments, its people dispersed into obscurity. Further west, the palaces of the Mycenaean world also suffered. Mycenaean Tiryns and Pylos show traces of fire and destruction. Their storerooms burned, their administrative tablets baked accidentally in the heat. These cities had stood as symbols of wealth and power, but within a generation they were left in ruin, their kings gone, their walls hollow monuments, Archaeologists find layers of destruction that often coincide across distant lands. Fires consumed palaces in Greece at the same time as cities burned in Anatolia and the Levant. The scale suggests not isolated accidents, but a wave of turmoil that swept across the region, leaving devastation in its wake. The destruction was not only physical but cultural. Libraries of tablets, archives of treaties, and records of trade all vanished. Without scribes and palaces, writing itself declined in many regions. The knowledge that had connected kingdoms dissolved, and centuries of recorded history fell silent. The ruins show patterns of abrupt abandonment. Tools left unfinished, meals left uneaten, and treasures buried in collapsed rooms tell us that many inhabitants fled in haste, never returning. These frozen moments capture the human side of collapse, the sudden interruption of ordinary lives by forces beyond control. For Ugarit, the destruction came so suddenly that letters on clay tablets were found in Kilnes, waiting to be sent. Their messages speak of enemies at sea, of urgent need for reinforcements. The fire that consumed the city baked the tablets hard, preserving them for archaeologists, yet silencing the people who wrote them. Hattusa's fall marks the end of the Hittite Empire. Once a rival to Egypt, with armies and chariots feared across the region, it left behind no successor state. Its fall was total, a disappearance from the stage of history. The empire that had written treaties with Ramses II was gone, leaving only scattered ruins and echoes of power. The Mycenaean collapse also altered Greece forever. Without the palaces, the Linear B script disappeared, and Greece entered what historians call a dark age. Knowledge was lost, trade dwindled, and communities shrank into isolated villages. The destruction of cities thus reshaped an entire civilization, reducing it to fragments of memory and myth. At times, the destruction seems targeted. Storerooms, palaces, and temples bear the heaviest scars, suggesting attackers sought to dismantle centers of power. Yet, not all towns fell. Some smaller settlements survived, indicating that the destruction was selective, focusing on the nodes of wealth and authority rather than every community. The Sea Peoples may have played a role in many of these destructions, though not all can be directly attributed to them. Raiders, migrants, or mercenaries could have attacked cities weakened by famine or internal conflict. In many cases, the fires may represent the culmination of multiple pressures converging at once. The human cost is difficult to measure, but the ruins hint at tragedy. Skeletons found in collapsed houses suggest lives cut short mid-flight. Graves appear in unusual places, hurried burials outside normal traditions. For survivors, the fall of cities meant not only loss of home but the unraveling of cultural identity. The silence that followed the destruction is as telling as the fires themselves. Once busy harbors emptied, trade routes ceased, and correspondence between kingdoms stopped. Letters that had crossed seas and deserts for centuries were no longer written. The collapse was not just physical, but communicative, the end of conversation between empires. In Greece, the memory of these destructions may have lived on in myth. Tales of cities laid waste, of wandering heroes, and of a war at Troy echo the turmoil of the late Bronze Age. While history and legend cannot be neatly separated, myth preserves the emotional memory of upheaval. In the Levant, destroyed cities left gaps soon filled by new populations. Groups once on the margins now took root in abandoned lands. What was ruin for one people became opportunity for another. The destruction of cities did not empty the land but reshaped who would call it home. For archaeologists, layers of destruction offer more than tragedy, they provide snapshots of transition. burned palaces, preserve artifacts otherwise lost. Tablets baked by fire survive when unbaked ones crumbled. In ruin, preservation paradoxically occurred, giving us glimpses of daily life in its final moments. The fall of Hattusa and Ugarit demonstrates how fragile even great powers can be. Walls, armies, and wealth provided no guarantee when faced with migration, famine, and conflict combined. Cities that seemed eternal to their inhabitants were, in reality, vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The destruction of cities also shows how interconnected the Bronze Age world had become. The fall of one trading partner destabilized others. With Ugarit gone, Cyprus lost a key link. With Mycenae weakened, Egypt lost an ally. The burning of one harbor sent shockwaves through distant markets. Not every city vanished. Some adapted, shrinking into smaller communities. Others fortified themselves more strongly. Survival was uneven, reminding us that history is rarely uniform. Yet the scale of destruction left scars so wide that recovery would take centuries, altering the very fabric of Mediterranean civilization. The ruins invite quiet reflection. Walking through the remains of Ugarit or Mycenae today, one feels the weight of sudden silence. Streets that once echoed with trade, music, and prayer now lie empty, their voices long gone. Stones remain, but the life that animated them was extinguished in fire and fear. For the survivors, the destruction of cities meant displacement. Families sought new lands, carrying traditions in memory rather than in stone. Migrants blended with others, forming the roots of new societies. Out of ruin, seeds of transformation were sown, though they grew slowly in uncertain soil. The destruction also marked the end of the Bronze Age system itself. Without cities to store goods, manage trade, and record transactions, the networks dissolved. Each empire once tied into the system was left standing alone, vulnerable without the web that had sustained them. The collapse of cities reminds us that history is both fragile and resilient. Fragile because great monuments can vanish in a single season. Resilient because, from the ashes, people rebuild, carrying fragments of old cultures into new forms. The fires of the late Bronze Age ended one world, but they also prepared the ground for another. As the flames consumed palaces and harbors, the Mediterranean world entered a new chapter. The cities that once shone as beacons of connection fell into ruin, their stories preserved only in scattered ruins and faint memories. The destruction was both an ending and a threshold, marking the passage from one age of history into the uncertain dawn of the Iron Age. When cities fell and empires fractured, not everyone vanished into silence. Many became wanderers, carrying their families, possessions, and traditions into uncertain lands. Migration was not a choice for glory, but a necessity for survival. Across the Mediterranean, displaced peoples sought new homes, reshaping the cultural map of the region. The sea peoples, remembered as raiders, were also migrants. Egyptian records depict not only warriors, but families with ox-drawn carts, children in tow, and belongings piled high. These images remind us that entire communities were on the move, driven by hunger, conflict, or environmental pressures beyond their control. Climate studies suggest that drought struck parts of the eastern Mediterranean in this period. Crops withered, rainfall lessened, and once rich farmlands grew barren. For societies dependent on agriculture, famine could unravel stability quickly. Migration became a way to escape scarcity, a search for fertile land where survival was possible. Earthquakes also left their mark. In the Aegean and Anatolia, layers of collapsed buildings coincide with this age. Survivors may have fled ruined towns, joining the tide of movement. What began as scattered groups of displaced families could swell into larger bands, traveling together for safety as they pressed into new territories. Migration is rarely peaceful. To those whose lands were entered, newcomers appeared as invaders, challenging established order. To the migrants themselves, the journey was one of desperation, guided by hope for survival. Two perspectives clashed on the same soil, one defending, the other pleading for space to live. Some groups settled in the Levant, where abandoned or weakened cities offered opportunity. The Peliset, often identified with the Philistines, may have established themselves in coastal Canaan after failing to breach Egypt. Archaeological evidence of new pottery styles, distinct from earlier traditions, suggests the arrival of new populations mixing with local ones. Cyprus, rich in copper and fertile harbors, also became a target for migration. Excavations reveal sudden shifts in culture, with fortified settlements and new burial customs. The influx of new groups reshaped the island, which became a crossroads of old and new traditions, blending local resilience with foreign influence. The story of migration is also one of adaptation. Displaced peoples brought with them skills, crafts, and knowledge. Pottery, weapon designs, and weaving techniques spread from one region to another, carried by hands that sought not conquest but livelihood. Cultural fusion was the quiet legacy of survival. Egypt itself absorbed some migrants. Captives taken in battle may have been resettled in frontier lands, serving as laborers or soldiers. Over time, these groups became part of the fabric of Egyptian society, their foreign origins remembered in records but slowly blending into the rhythms of the Nile. For the ordinary person, migration meant uncertainty. Families traveled through hostile lands, unsure whether they would find welcome or rejection. Camps formed along coastlines, with makeshift shelters of wood and cloth. Fires burned in the night, while stories of lost homes and uncertain futures echoed around them. Survival required resilience. Communities had to adapt quickly to new environments, learning which crops could grow, which animals could thrive, and which neighbors might offer alliance. In this way, migration was not only a movement of people, but also of knowledge, and survival strategies reshaped for unfamiliar lands. The disruption of trade encouraged self-reliance. Where once communities depended on imported goods, migrants and survivors turned to local resources. Metalwork adapted, pottery shifted, and diets changed. Necessity pushed innovation, and survival forged new patterns of life that endured long after the age of collapse. Not all groups survived intact. Some vanished into the societies they joined, their distinct identity fading with time. Others endured in memory, remembered by names, carved in stone, or echoed in myth. The act of migration preserved life, but not always identity, as cultures blended and transformed in new lands. The Levant, in particular, became a patchwork of newcomers and locals. Archaeological layers reveal the emergence of new towns with mixed styles, suggesting cooperation as much as conflict. These settlements became the seeds of later societies, born from the blending of displaced peoples with indigenous traditions. The Bronze Age collapse reminds us that survival often comes not from strength alone, but from adaptation. Migrants carried what they could and reshaped what they found. Their resilience ensured that while empires fell, people continued. The human spirit endured, even when palaces crumbled and libraries turned to ash. Legends of wandering peoples may echo these migrations. Later myths of displaced heroes, of journeys across seas and struggles to find new homes. mirror the experiences of those who lived through this turbulent age. Myth preserved what records could not: the emotional memory of survival and movement. Migration also shifted languages. Dialects traveled, merged, and evolved. The spread of new linguistic patterns in the Iron Age may reflect the mingling of migrants with locals, creating the foundation for future tongues that carried traces of many origins within them. Weapons to reveal adaptation. Migrants carried styles of swords and spears unknown to locals, introducing new designs. Over time, these weapons were copied and modified, blending foreign influence with native craftsmanship. Survival depended not only on food, but on the tools of defense and hunting. The memory of displacement likely shaped social identity for generations. Stories of lost homelands and perilous journeys would have been told at firesides, passed from elders to children. Even when new roots took hold, the narrative of migration became part of cultural heritage, a reminder of resilience. Migration was not uniform. Some groups traveled by sea, others by land. Some moved as families, others as warriors seeking employment or conquest. This diversity explains why the Sea Peoples appear so varied in Egyptian records. They were not a single nation, but many, each with its own story of movement and survival. The disruption of the old world was painful, but it opened spaces for new societies to emerge. As migrants settled and adapted, they created hybrid cultures that would shape the coming Iron Age. From the ashes of collapse, the seeds of transformation were planted by those who endured the journey. Survival was also a matter of negotiation. Migrants sometimes served as mercenaries, offering their strength to kings in exchange for land or security. In this way, outsiders became insiders, reshaping the armies and politics of the lands they entered. Adaptation was not only agricultural but political. Archaeological traces of migration can be subtle. A new pottery design, a different burial custom, a shift in diet. Yet these small details together tell the story of human movement, of survival through change. Each shard of pottery is a footprint of someone who carried their world into new soil. The great cities had fallen, but people lived on. Migration and survival ensured continuity, though in altered form. Where once empires had stood, smaller communities thrived, slowly building the foundations for future civilizations. In their resilience lies the true story of the Bronze Age collapse, not just loss, but endurance. As the tide of migration spread across the Mediterranean, the world entered a new phase. The old order was gone, but humanity adapted, finding ways to survive in unfamiliar lands. Out of displacement came transformation, a quiet legacy of endurance that carried forward into the dawn of the Iron Age. The late Bronze Age world was bound together by networks of trade as delicate and vital as threads in a woven cloth. Copper from Cyprus, tin from distant lands, grain from Egypt, and textiles from the Levant passed through harbors and caravans. These routes fed empires, sustained armies, and connected distant peoples in ways unseen before. When the networks faltered, the world they supported faltered too. Imagine the harbor of Ugarit before the collapse. Ships anchored side by side, merchants unloading jars of oil, ingots of copper, and crates of grain. Scribes noted each exchange in clay records, while dockworkers carried goods into warehouses. This rhythm had been steady for centuries, and its disruption was like silence after a familiar song. When cities burned and migrations spread, these lifelines of trade fractured. Ships that once sailed with safety now faced seas haunted by raiders. Overland caravans crossed roads less secure, where bandits or desperate wanderers could attack. What had been highways of prosperity turned into paths of risk, and merchants hesitated to travel them. Without trade, the supply of bronze, the very metal of the age, was threatened. Bronze required both copper and tin was especially rare, often imported from far beyond the Mediterranean. When those routes collapsed, so too did the ability to arm soldiers and craft tools, striking at the core of Bronze Age societies. Egypt, long a supplier of grain, found its role as provider strained. Letters from neighboring kingdoms pleaded for shipments, but with conflicts and raids at sea, deliveries faltered. Even Egypt's abundant harvests could not reach their allies if ships were lost or ports destroyed. Isolation crept into a world once closely bound. For the Hittites, the loss of trade meant famine. Archives record urgent appeals for grain from Egypt, but with routes disrupted, those pleas often went unanswered. Without steady supplies, the Hittite heartland weakened. Cities once supported by distant goods grew vulnerable, their power unraveling as their granaries emptied. The Mycenaean kingdoms, too, relied on imported materials. Their palaces recorded inventories of bronze, oil, and livestock, but these depended on external links. When trade collapsed, they faced shortages that no fortress walls could withstand. Without imports, even kings could not maintain their courts or armies. On Cyprus, copper production slowed. Mines that once poured ingots into international markets now saw fewer ships arrive to carry them. Stockpiles dwindled, and the island's role as a hub of the Bronze Age economy diminished. With demand collapsing, Cyprus itself became a target for raids and migration. Trade was not only about materials, but also about ideas. With fewer ships and caravans, the exchange of knowledge declined. Medicines, technologies, and cultural practices, once shared across kingdoms, no longer traveled. Isolation bred stagnation, and the creative spark of interconnectedness dimmed. Archaeological evidence shows shifts in pottery styles during this time. Once, imported luxury ceramics from distant lands filled elite households. After the collapse, local imitations replaced them, often cruder and less refined. This reflects not only artistic change, but also the absence of international goods once taken for granted. The breakdown of trade also meant the decline of scribal networks. Diplomatic letters, once carried between courts, ceased to arrive. Kings who had addressed one another as brothers grew silent, their clay voices ending abruptly. The silence of archives reveals the collapse of the conversation that had bound empires together. Markets shrank. Where once merchants spoke many languages in bustling squares, now trade became local, limited to nearby villages. Goods that once traveled across seas became rare treasures, while daily life returned to simpler patterns, focused on survival rather than luxury. The absence of trade left elites particularly vulnerable. Palaces had thrived on imported wealth, using it to display power. Without access to foreign goods, rulers lost prestige, and their authority weakened. For ordinary people, the change was also profound, but for kings, it threatened the very foundation of their rule. The collapse of networks also revealed how dependent societies had become on one another. Independence was no longer possible in a world where bronze depended on distant mines and grain depended on ships. When links broke, there was no easy substitute. The system had grown too complex, too interwoven, to survive disconnection. For some communities, adaptation came through simplification. Tools once made of bronze were replaced with iron, a metal harder to work but more widely available. Iron smelting spread, marking the dawn of a new age born out of necessity. the disruption of bronze trade may have accelerated this shift. The loss of long-distance trade also shifted diets. Exotic imports like spices or wines from distant lands vanished, replaced by local staples. What had once been a table of variety narrowed into meals shaped by immediate soil and climate. Even daily bread reflected the contraction of the wider world. In some regions, fortresses rose around surviving harbors, a sign that leaders sought to protect what remained of their trade. Yet these efforts could not restore the old networks. At best, they preserved fragments, keeping small roots alive, while the grand web of the Bronze Age unraveled. The absence of tin was especially critical. Without it, bronze became scarce, and societies turned increasingly to iron. This technological change may have seemed small at first, but reshaped warfare, agriculture, and daily life. Out of the collapse of trade came an innovation that defined the Iron Age. The emotional impact of losing trade must have been profound. Merchants who once traveled to distant lands now found their paths closed. Stories of journeys and adventures ceased, replaced by isolation. The world felt smaller, horizons nearer, and possibilities fewer, leaving communities with a sense of contraction. For Egypt, survival meant tightening its grip on internal resources. Grain stored along the Nile became even more precious, guarded carefully. Without reliable allies abroad, Egypt turned inward, sustaining itself but no longer serving as the great provider to its neighbors. Isolation replaced its earlier generosity. The fall of trade networks also ended an age of diplomacy. The international system, once supported by gifts, alliances, and correspondence, collapsed with the goods that made such gestures possible. Kings who could no longer exchange wealth lost the means to maintain peace through generosity. This breakdown left space for smaller communities to thrive. Without dependence on distant imports, local cultures grew more self-reliant. They adapted their crafts, reshaped their economies, and found new strength in independence. The fall of the grand networks gave rise to a mosaic of smaller societies. Archaeologists studying shipwrecks from this era find them laden with cargo that never reached its destination. Amphorae of oil, ingots of copper, and jars of wine lie preserved beneath the sea. Silent witnesses to voyages interrupted by storms or raiders. Each wreck is a frozen reminder of the fragility of trade. The shattered networks mark the true end of the Bronze Age system. Without them, empires withered, palaces fell, and archives grew silent. What remained was a simpler, more fragmented world, where survival depended on local strength rather than distant allies. The great web of connection was gone. As the networks dissolved, the Mediterranean entered a quieter age. Trade no longer bound empires together, but people endured, reshaping their lives to fit the new reality. The fall of trade was not only an end, but also a beginning. The slow dawn of the Iron Age, when new forms of connection would one day rise again. When written records fell silent, memory shifted into stories. Myths and legends carried fragments of truth, reshaped through generations of telling. The collapse of the Late Bronze Age, with its migrations and ruined cities, may have lived on in tales of wandering heroes, battles for lost kingdoms, and gods who abandoned or protected their people. In Greece, the poems later attributed to Homer reflect a world both familiar and transformed. The Iliad and the Odyssey speak of cities under siege, of warriors traveling across seas, and of homes left in ruin. Though set in a heroic past, these epics may preserve echoes of the disruptions that followed the Bronze Age collapse. The story of Troy, immortalized in Greek tradition, resembles the fate of many cities destroyed in the upheaval. whether or not the war was real as described. The memory of a great city consumed by fire may reflect lived experience, shared by many who saw palaces crumble and harbors fall silent. The wandering of Odysseus, moving from shore to shore, encountering strangers and challenges, mirrors the migrations of displaced peoples. His journey may symbolize more than one man's voyage. It may represent an age when seas no longer carried safe trade but uncertainty, and every coastline promised both danger and hope. In the Levant, biblical traditions describe the arrival of new groups into Canaan. The Philistines, often linked with the Peliset of Egyptian records, appear as formidable outsiders, reshaping the coastal regions. These stories preserve the memory of migration and settlement, woven into sacred texts centuries later. Even the Hebrew Bible's accounts of wandering in the wilderness, of searching for a homeland, echo the larger reality of peoples displaced during this time. Whether literal or symbolic, these narratives reflect the deep imprint of migration on the cultural memory of the Near East. Egypt, to preserved memory in mythic tones. Pharaohs cast themselves as defenders of cosmic, order-agent forces of chaos. The sea peoples, described as invaders from afar, may have embodied that chaos. In Egyptian thought, their defeat was not only military but spiritual, ensuring that the gods still favored the Nile. Legends often simplify complex events. For those who lived through famine, earthquakes, and invasions, myth offered a framework. Disasters became divine punishment, victories became divine favor. In this way, myths served as explanations, soothing and terrifying, turning history into timeless lessons. The Greek story of the return of the Heraclidae, descendants of Heracles, may reflect memories of migrations. Tales of exiled families reclaiming lands after long journeys may echo the displacements and resettlements that followed. The fall of the Mycenaean palaces, songs and oral traditions carried these memories long before they were written down. Around fires and in marketplaces, storytellers recounted the fall of cities, the wandering of peoples, and the endurance of survivors. Each retelling reshaped details, but the essence of upheaval remained alive in memory. Archaeology and myth sometimes meet. Pottery styles, settlement patterns, and evidence of migration align with tales of newcomers arriving in foreign lands. Myths, while not precise records, offer a human dimension to these shifts, allowing us to glimpse how people understood their changing world. The story of Aeneas, preserved later in Roman tradition, speaks of a Trojan survivor founding new routes after destruction. While composed centuries after the events, it resonates with the theme of displacement, shaping new beginnings. Such tales suggest that memory of collapse endured far beyond the ruins themselves. The motif of wandering is universal. From Greece to the Levant, myths emphasize exile, search, and return. These reflect not only heroic journeys, but collective memories of migration. When communities carried their past into uncertain futures, guided by stories that gave meaning to their trials, the gods, too, reflect the turbulence of the age. Storm gods, sea gods, and deities of chaos gained prominence in myths, mirroring the forces that shaped human lives. The unpredictability of nature and the violence of strangers found expression in divine figures who embodied both terror and hope. In Cyprus, legends of new settlers and foreign arrivals may echo the blending of cultures after migrations. The island's myths tell of heroes arriving from distant lands, fitting the archaeological evidence of cultural fusion. In story and in artifact, memory of arrival endured. For the people who lived through these times, Myth was also a way of coping. By framing disaster as part of a divine plan or heroic cycle, they gave purpose to suffering. What might otherwise seem meaningless, destruction became a tale of destiny, survival, and eventual renewal. The loss of writing in many regions meant that oral memory carried greater weight. Without archives to record events, stories became the archives. Generations of singers and storytellers acted as living libraries, holding the memory of collapse until writing re-emerged in the Iron Age. The power of myth lies in its ability to outlast history. While specific details of battles and migrations faded, the themes endured. Ruined cities became legendary wars, wandering peoples became heroic journeys, and forgotten names became immortal characters. Myth preserved what ruins alone could not. Even today, scholars find in myth traces of ancient collapse. Earthquakes remembered as divine wrath, migrations remembered as heroic voyages, and ruined cities remembered as fateful wars. Each offers clues to how the Bronze Age transition was felt by those who survived it. For ordinary people, myths carried reassurance. If their struggles mirrored the trials of heroes, then survival had meaning. If gods had once guided wanderers, then perhaps they too would find guidance. In this way, myth became both memory and comfort, blending history with hope. The persistence of myth suggests that the memory of collapse was too profound to vanish. Though archives were lost, though palaces lay in ash, the stories endured, carried by voice and imagination. Myth became the bridge from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, ensuring that the essence of memory survived. These myths also shaped later identities. Greeks looked to the Age of Heroes for inspiration, Hebrews remembered struggles for land and faith, and Egyptians recalled victories that affirmed divine favor. Each culture wove its past into myth, drawing strength and meaning from the memory of crisis. In studying the myths of this era, we glimpse not precise history but emotional truth, the fear of collapse, the longing for home, the pride of survival. These truths, though clothed in legend, bring us closer to the lived experience of people who endured the transition from one age to another. The memory in myth shows us that even when history falls silent, humanity finds ways to remember. Fireside tales, poetic songs, and sacred stories carried fragments of a vanished world into new generations, ensuring that the collapse was never fully forgotten. As the myths echo across time, they remind us that history is not only written in stone and clay, but also in story. The destruction of cities, the migrations of peoples, and the resilience of survivors live on in the legends we still tell. In their whispers, the Bronze Age continues to breathe. Out of the ruins of the late Bronze Age, new societies slowly began to take shape. Though the great palaces and empires had fallen, people did not disappear. They adapted, rebuilding lives in smaller communities, planting seeds that would grow into the cultures of the Iron Age. What seemed like an ending was also a quiet beginning. Villages rose where palaces had once stood. Without centralized kings, local leaders guided their communities. Farmers returned to their fields, shepherds tended their flocks, and artisans shaped tools from whatever resources remained. Life became simpler, yet within that simplicity lay resilience, a foundation for renewal. Ironworking spread across these smaller societies. Unlike bronze, which required long-distance trade, iron could be sourced locally. It was more difficult to smelt, yet once mastered, it provided a reliable material for tools and weapons. This shift marked not only survival but transformation, ushering in a new technological age. In Greece, the collapse of Mycenaean palaces gave way to what historians call the Dark Age. Yet even in this time, seeds of renewal were planted. Communities reorganized, oral traditions thrived, and new forms of social structure developed. From this foundation, the Greek city-states would later rise, carrying echoes of both ruin and rebirth. On Cyprus, the blending of local populations with newcomers created hybrid cultures. Pottery styles changed, burial customs shifted, and fortifications grew stronger. These adjustments reflected not weakness, but adaptation, the ability of a society to absorb change and transform it into lasting identity. The Levant became a crossroads for emerging groups. Philistines settled along the coast, while Israelites formed in the highlands. Phoenician cities, such as Tyre and Sidon, began to flourish, carrying forward maritime traditions that would later spread across the Mediterranean. Out of the collapse, diversity and innovation grew. In Anatolia, smaller states rose from the shadow of the fallen Hittite Empire. Known as Neo-Hittite kingdoms, these polities preserved elements of Hittite culture while adapting to the new realities of a fragmented world. They built fortresses, carved inscriptions, and maintained memory, even as their power was far smaller than before. Egypt, though weakened, endured. Its survival allowed continuity of tradition, though its empire never returned to former heights. In later centuries, Egypt would be ruled by foreign dynasties, but the memory of resilience during the time of the Sea Peoples remained part of its cultural pride. Trade slowly revived, though in different forms. Instead of large, interconnected networks, smaller routes emerged. Local exchange became the norm, with merchants traveling shorter distances. Over time, these smaller systems would expand again, laying the groundwork for the renewed maritime powers of the Iron Age. The seeds of alphabetic writing also emerged in this era. The Ugaritic script and other simplified systems influenced the development of the Phoenician alphabet, which spread widely in the centuries that followed. From collapse came innovation in communication, a tool that would shape the literacy of future civilizations. Myth and memory guided identity in these new societies. Stories of lost cities and wandering ancestors became part of their heritage, giving meaning to their survival. Communities defined themselves not only by their present, but also by the narratives of endurance they carried from the past. Agriculture adapted to changing conditions. In regions affected by drought, people developed new techniques, planting hardier crops and diversifying their food sources. These adjustments allowed communities to withstand the uncertainties that had once driven them into famine. The new societies valued cooperation at the local level. Without great palaces to manage resources, families and villages had to rely on each other more directly. Shared labor, collective storage, and communal defense became essential, fostering bonds that sustained them through lean times. Religious practices also shifted. Without monumental temples, worship often moved into smaller shrines or household rituals. The gods did not vanish, but devotion became more personal and local. This intimacy with the divine reflected the new social realities smaller communities seeking comfort in accessible traditions. Art continued, though transformed. Instead of grand frescoes and monumental carvings, decoration appeared on pottery, textiles, and smaller objects. Creativity persisted, reshaping itself into forms suited for simpler lives. These artistic choices carried forward beauty and identity even in diminished circumstances. In Greece, oral poetry preserved memory, eventually giving rise to epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey. Though written down later, these stories sustained cultural continuity during the centuries when writing had disappeared. In this way, tradition became the seed of future literature and identity. The Phoenicians, rising from this period of change, developed seafaring skills that would spread their culture far and wide. By navigating the Mediterranean with renewed vigor, they became heirs to the maritime legacy of the late Bronze Age, turning survival into expansion. In the highlands of Canaan, small agricultural villages grew, gradually forming into societies that would shape biblical history. These modest beginnings, rooted in resilience, became the foundation for identities that endured for centuries, their seeds planted in the shadow of collapse. Migration itself planted seeds. The displaced peoples who settled new lands blended traditions, introducing fresh ideas and crafts. The cultural mosaics that emerged reflected both continuity and innovation, creating societies richer than either old or new alone. The decline of old elites allowed new leadership to rise. Without powerful kings, local chieftains and councils took prominence. Power was less centralized, more communal, and perhaps more adaptable to the changing world. The seeds of future political diversity were sown in this fragmented landscape. Iron tools improved agriculture, allowing more land to be cleared and more crops to be grown. This, in turn, supported growing populations. Though the Bronze Age system had collapsed, the Iron Age opened opportunities for expansion, sustained by new technologies born from necessity. Over generations, memory of collapse softened into legend, while the resilience of survival grew into identity. New societies did not think of themselves as mere survivors, but as inheritors of a past that gave them strength. In this way, collapse became not an end but a story of origins. The seeds of new societies remind us that history does not only dwell in loss. From burned palaces and abandoned harbors came fresh beginnings, carried forward by people who refused to vanish. Their quiet determination reshaped the Mediterranean world into something new and enduring. Even as ruins stood as reminders of what was gone, villages thrived nearby, fields were tilled again, and ships ventured once more across the seas. The rhythm of life returned, altered but unbroken. From fragments, a mosaic of new cultures emerged, vibrant and lasting. The Bronze Age ended in destruction, yet the Iron Age began with renewal. The seeds of new societies were sown in the ashes of collapse, growing into the roots of the civilizations that followed. Their story is not only one of survival, but of transformation, a reminder that history is always both ending and beginning. Across the Mediterranean world, the first generations after the collapse lived among ruins. To them, broken walls and burned palaces were not distant memories, but everyday scenery. Children played among toppled stones, farmers tilled fields beside blackened temples, and traders passed by empty gates. What had once been grand monuments now stood as silent reminders that greatness can vanish, leaving only echoes behind. For many survivors, ruins were more than scars, they became part of the landscape of life. A palace that once housed a king might now shelter shepherds or provide stones for new homes. Temples, emptied of priests and offerings, became quiet spaces where winds whispered through columns. In this way, the ruins became woven into ordinary life, no longer centers of power, but still holding memory in their presence. The echo of ruins shaped identity. People told stories of the old cities, describing their fall with awe and sorrow. A burned wall was not just rubble, but a lesson, a reminder of fragility. As generations passed, the ruins carried meaning beyond stone. They became symbols of warning, resilience, and continuity. The silent halls spoke, even when no one remembered the names of the kings who built them. Ruins held layers of memory. For elders who had seen palaces in their glory, the silence was grief. For their grandchildren, who knew only the broken walls, the ruins were curiosities. The contrast between memory and lived experience created two worlds in one, a past of grandeur and a present of survival. Both coexisted, haunting and humbling the generations that followed. The echo of ruins was not always mournful. In some places, they offered shelter. Abandoned storerooms became granaries for farmers. Collapsed walls became foundations for new houses. The old and the new lived side by side. Proof that humanity does not abandon the past, but bends it into new shapes for survival. In this way, ruins themselves became part of resilience. Travelers spoke of ruins as landmarks. Along trade routes, collapsed towers or blackened gates marked the journey. To pass by them was to be reminded of both danger and endurance. The stories that surrounded them grew richer with time tales of battles, of gods, of heroes who fought in the final hours of the fallen cities. Each ruin became a monument, not only of stone but of imagination. The echo of ruins shaped myths as much as memory. A burned city might become the inspiration for a tale of divine punishment, its fall blamed on angered gods. Another ruin might be remembered as the home of legendary kings or heroes. The facts blurred, but the ruins remained, steady in their silence, lending weight to the stories woven around them. In places like Mycenae, massive walls still stood even after the palaces fell. Later generations, unable to imagine how such stones were lifted, claimed they were built by giants. The ruins inspired wonder, showing how the remains of one civilization could become the myths of another. The echo was not only of loss, but of awe. For the common people, ruins may have felt both protective and unsettling. To live in their shadow was to live with reminders of vulnerability. Yet, at the same time, the stones gave comfort, proof that others had lived, built, and endured. In this way, ruins offered both lessons and reassurance, grounding new lives in the memory of old. The echo of ruins carried across landscapes. Farmers working in fields might look up to see collapsed towers on nearby hills. Sailors might pass harbors lined with empty warehouses. Even when abandoned, the cities remained part of daily awareness. The silence of ruins shaped the rhythm of survival, reminding all who saw them of the fragility of order. Some ruins became sacred places. Communities left offerings at the remains of temples, believing that the spirits of the past lingered there. Fires burned at broken altars, prayers whispered into the wind. In ruins, people felt the presence of ancestors and gods, turning shattered stones into places of quiet devotion. Others avoided ruins altogether. To some, they were haunted spaces, dangerous and unsettling. Stories of curses, ghosts, or restless spirits grew around blackened palaces. Abandoned walls became thresholds between the living and the dead, warnings of what happens when hubris angers the divine, or when societies forget balance. The echo of ruins was also practical. Stones were reused to build new walls, temples, and houses. Wood from collapsed roofs was carried away for fuel. The materials of grandeur were recycled into the tools of survival. The past literally became the foundation of the future, each new structure carrying fragments of fallen worlds. Archaeologists today see these layers clearly. Beneath new settlements lie the remnants of older ones, foundations built over ruins, walls rising again from shattered bases. For ancient people, this was natural. Life went on, and the past was not discarded but reshaped, one stone at a time. The echo of ruins also preserved memory in unexpected ways. When cities burned, clay tablets hardened in the fire, surviving for us to read today. Without destruction, much would have been lost. Paradoxically, The fall of cities preserved their voices, turning disaster into memory etched in clay. For storytellers, ruins provided stage and symbol. To walk past them was to walk past history itself. Tales grew in the presence of broken gates, transforming into warnings or inspirations. The ruins spoke to imagination as loudly as to memory, becoming part of the cultural fabric of the new age. Children who grew up among ruins may have felt curiosity more than grief. To them, toppled stones were places to climb, caves to explore, mysteries to wonder about. Their innocence transformed tragedy into play, showing how life adapts, even when surrounded by reminders of collapse. Generations later, people no longer remembered the exact events that caused the destruction. Yet the ruins remained. With memory fading, myth grew stronger, filling gaps with stories. The echo of ruins became the seed of legends, carrying fragments of truth wrapped in imagination. The echo also carried into politics. Leaders of small communities pointed to the ruins of great cities as lessons. Even mighty empires can fall. Such reminders were both warnings and opportunities. Power had shifted, and the ruins testified that no kingdom was eternal. In their silence, they offered perspective. The echo of ruins traveled with migrants. Families displaced by collapse carried stories of the cities they left behind. Even if their new homes thrived, the memory of ruins remained part of their identity. To remember a fallen city was to remember resilience, a thread binding past and future together. The ruins themselves became teachers of humility. They stood as reminders that human effort, however grand, is subject to forces beyond control, earthquakes, famine, invasion, or time itself. For those who walked among them, the stones spoke softly. Nothing lasts forever, yet life continues. The echo of ruins can still be felt today. Archaeologists brush dust from carved inscriptions, and tourists walk among broken pillars. What survivors once saw with grief, we now see with curiosity. Yet the silence remains the same, a whisper across centuries, carrying the memory of endurance and loss. The presence of ruins shaped not only memory, but also imagination of the future. To build anew beside them was to acknowledge both continuity and change. Survivors did not live outside of history, they lived inside it, their lives framed by the stones of what had come before. The echo of ruins was not the end of a story, but the middle of one. Out of their silence, people rebuilt. Out of their stones, new homes rose. Out of their memory, new societies grew. The ruins were not only evidence of collapse, but soil for renewal, where the past nourished the seeds of what was to come. As we reflect on the echo of ruins, we are reminded that history is always present in the landscapes we inhabit. Each broken wall, each scarred foundation, carries more than silence, it carries the persistence of memory. The ruins of the Bronze Age were not lifeless, they were voices, whispering of fragility, resilience, and the enduring strength of human survival. In the wake of collapse, authority changed shape. Where once kings ruled from great palaces, their voices carried across seas, the world now turned quieter. Leadership shrank to smaller circles, village elders, chieftains, councils of families. The grandeur of international kingship faded, replaced by local rule rooted in survival rather than ambition. The palaces that once echoed with scribes and courtiers fell silent. Without kings to command armies or scribes to send letters, communities turned inward. Local leaders managed grain, organized defenses, and made decisions face to face, not through clay tablets. Authority grew smaller, but perhaps more personal, more immediate to daily life. This shift of power changed the rhythm of society. People no longer relied on distant rulers who lived in palaces beyond their reach. Instead, they looked to those who worked beside them, leaders who shared their struggles. The authority of crowns gave way to the authority of presence, earned by those who stood with their people. In Greece, the fall of the Mycenaean kings left fortresses empty. Without palatial control, villages grew more independent. Small councils made choices that once required royal decree. The absence of centralized rule allowed freedom, but also fragmentation. What had once been one system fractured into many smaller ones. In Anatolia, the fall of Hattusa left space for smaller states to rise. Neo-Hittite kingdoms emerged, building fortresses and carving inscriptions to preserve fragments of their past. Though their power was modest compared to the empire, they carried memory forward, ensuring the legacy of Hatti did not vanish entirely. In the Levant, new groups asserted themselves. Philistines, Israelites, and Phoenicians each carved space in the vacuum left by collapse. With no single empire to dominate, smaller polities thrived, shaping identities that would endure for centuries. Out of weakness, diversity took root. Egypt, though surviving, also changed. Pharaohs no longer ruled a vast international empire, but a more contained kingdom. Their power remained symbolic, yet resources strained. Authority became less about projecting dominance abroad and more about maintaining stability at home. Even survival required adaptation. The shift of power was not always peaceful. Without strong central control, disputes between neighbors grew sharper. Raids and rivalries multiplied as communities defended scarce resources. Authority became tied not only to leadership, but to protection, the ability to guard grain, land, and families against uncertainty. For ordinary people, the change in power may have felt mixed. Some found relief that distant kings no longer demanded heavy taxes or forced labor for great projects. Others felt vulnerability, as small villages lacked the armies and walls of old. Leadership was closer, but also more fragile, dependent on the strength of individuals. Power expressed itself differently. Instead of monumental palaces, influence was shown in the number of cattle owned, the fields cultivated, or the loyalty of neighbors. Authority became measured in practical wealth and trust, not in gold-plated thrones or international treaties. The absence of great kings also changed diplomacy. Without letters exchanged across empires, communication narrowed to local agreements. Alliances were forged not between mighty rulers but between small communities, often sealed by marriage, trade, or shared defense. Power became woven from many smaller threads. This decentralization reshaped culture. Without central palaces to dictate art or architecture, local styles flourished. Pottery, weaving, and song reflected village traditions rather than royal preferences. The shift of power allowed creativity to diversify, planting seeds for distinct cultural identities. In some places, new elites rose, though never as powerful as the old kings. A strong warrior, a respected elder, or a wealthy farmer might become a leader. Their authority rested not on divine titles, but on visible strength and trust. Power became grounded in lived reality, not distant rituals. This change mirrored the ruins that surrounded them. Just as great walls stood broken, so too did great authority. In their place, smaller structures rose, both physical and social. The rhythm of power became modest, but also resilient, less likely to collapse all at once. For the Phoenicians, the shift of power created opportunity. Their cities, small but resourceful, thrived in the absence of larger empires. By mastering the sea, they built influence not through conquest, but through trade. Authority flowed outward from their harbors, subtle but lasting, shaping centuries to come. The Israelites, settling in the highlands, also reflect this change. Their society grew around tribes and families, guided by elders and shared traditions. They lacked monumental kingship in the early years, yet their cohesion lay in memory, faith, and community rather than in grand palaces. In Cyprus, fortified towns appeared, defended by local leaders. Authority there was practical: to guard the mines, to protect harbors, to keep families safe. Power was no longer about commanding empires, but about keeping survival steady. The shift of power also created new kinds of resilience. With authority spread across many communities, collapse was less total. Even if one town failed, others endured. The fragmentation of power allowed diversity of survival strategies, ensuring that humanity continued through many small fires rather than one great flame. Myth later remembered this change as a time of wandering leaders, heroes rising not from palaces but from hardship. Stories of men who guided their people through trials reflect the reality that authority now came from resilience, not inheritance. The mythic echoed the lived. Archaeology reveals these shifts in settlement patterns. Instead of grand cities, small villages spread across hills and valleys. Their modest remains reflect modest power stones, shaped for homes, not palaces, walls for protection, not ceremony. Power had moved closer to the earth. The echo of kingship never fully disappeared. In time, new monarchies would rise again, claiming divine authority. But in this era, power was quiet, local, and often temporary. Authority lay not in crowns, but in hands, calloused by work and hardened by defense. This shift reminds us that history is not always about the grand and the mighty. Sometimes it is about the humble and the small, the leaders whose names we do not know but whose choices preserved communities. Their unseen power carried the thread of survival through uncertain times. The fall of empires reshaped the very meaning of leadership. It was no longer about commanding thousands across distant lands, but guiding dozens through daily struggles. This smaller scale of authority did not shine as brightly, but it endured more steadily, rooted in necessity. The shifts of power after the collapse show us how adaptable human societies are. When one form of leadership ends, another emerges. When crowns fall, councils rise. Authority never vanishes, changes shape, adjusting to what survival requires. This is the quiet strength of history. As we reflect on the shifts of power, we see that the fall of kings did not mean the end of leadership. It meant its transformation. From palaces to villages, from emperors to elders, authority continued, smaller but steady. In this way, power itself survived collapse, echoing not in grandeur but in the resilience of communities. After the fires dimmed and the walls collapsed, life did not vanish. Among the ashes of palaces and temples, survivors began to build again. They did not have the wealth or grandeur of their ancestors, but they had determination. With bare hands and quiet resilience, they shaped a new existence among the ruins of the old world. Daily life took on a humbler rhythm. Families built small homes of mud, brick, and stone gathered from collapsed palaces. Where once kings dined in great halls, now farmers sat around hearths, sharing bread and water. The contrast was stark, yet within the simplicity lay a kind of stability the grandeur of empires had never fully offered. Agriculture remained the foundation of survival. Farmers sowed barley and wheat, herded sheep and goats, and tended olive trees that endured even through chaos. In the ashes of destroyed granaries, new harvests grew. Food became not a symbol of trade or tribute, but the anchor of communities striving to endure. Crafts also adapted. Potters no longer shaped fine wares for distant markets, but created simple vessels for storing grain and water. Blacksmiths experimented with iron tools, more difficult to forge but more available than bronze. These crafts, though modest, allowed families to rebuild their lives step by step. Religion did not disappear, it transformed. Without towering temples, worship shifted into homes and small shrines. Families lit lamps, poured libations, and whispered prayers to the gods. In the ashes of monumental faith, personal devotion grew, shaping a spirituality rooted in intimacy and survival. Children grew up among the ruins, never knowing the full grandeur of what came before. For them, toppled columns were climbing places, burned walls were part of the horizon. Their innocence softened the sorrow of loss, showing that even in landscapes of destruction, life renews itself in laughter and play. Communities leaned on each other more than ever. Where once kings organized supplies, now neighbors shared resources. Harvests were divided, herds grazed collectively, and walls were built together. Survival depended on cooperation, not command, binding people closer in bonds of necessity. Trade became small and local. Great caravans and fleets had faded, but nearby villages exchanged oil, wool, and grain. Fishermen still cast nets into the sea, shepherds still traded milk and cheese, and artisans bartered their crafts. Life was quieter, but not silent. The hum of small exchanges replaced the roar of international trade. Meals grew simpler but steady. Instead of exotic imports, families ate bread, olives, lentils, and fish. These humble foods sustained life, proving that survival rests not on luxury, but on the quiet persistence of daily labor. The ashes of palaces gave way to the hearthfires of homes. Festivals, once grand processions, continued in smaller form. Villagers sang songs, danced around fires, and told stories of ancestors. Though temples had fallen, the spirit of celebration remained, reminding survivors that joy could be found even in times of hardship. The echo of life outshone the silence of ruin. The ashes themselves became resources. Burned clay hardened into stronger fragments, used again in construction. Charred timbers became fuel, broken stones became foundations. Nothing was wasted, for survival required turning destruction into tools of renewal. The past became part of the present, reshaped by need. For women and men alike, daily routines changed little in essence. Fields were plowed, water drawn, cloth woven, children cared for. These small acts, repeated each day, were the true backbone of survival. The fall of kings mattered less than the endurance of ordinary labor. Stories carried meaning into the new age. Around fires, elders spoke of the cities that had once stood, of the gods who watched, of the battles fought. Children listened, wide-eyed, their imaginations filling ruins with life. Through story, memory survived, turning ashes into seeds of identity. Communities found strength in memory. To recall what had been lost was not only grief, but motivation. The ruins around them were reminders of fragility, but also of possibility. They showed that life had flourished once, and could flourish again, if nurtured with patience and care. New forms of art emerged. Instead of palace frescoes, beauty appeared in woven textiles, decorated pottery, and carved amulets. These creations were modest, but they carried personal meaning, symbols of identity and hope. Even among ashes, art endured, proving that creativity never fully dies. The ashes also taught humility. Families no longer trusted in the permanence of walls or wealth. They trusted instead in the land, in the seasons, and in one another. The grandeur of kings had failed, but the resilience of communities had not. This was the lesson written in smoke and stone. Children learned different skills than before. They were not trained for courtly life or distant trade, but for farming, weaving, and simple craftsmanship. These skills carried families forward, ensuring survival. In the ashes, education shifted from luxury to necessity, grounding the future in the soil of the present. Life among the ashes was quiet, yet meaningful. Without the roar of empires, the songs of daily life grew louder. The sound of fields worked, of pots shaped, of animals tended. These became the music of survival, a softer but steadier rhythm than the thunder of armies. The resilience of survivors shows in archaeology. Layers of ash are followed by layers of new settlement, proof that people returned, rebuilt, and endured. Each burned city became the foundation of new life, a testament to humanity's refusal to vanish. The ashes did not silence, they prepared the ground. Faith in the future grew slowly but steadily. Families planted trees, knowing they would not live to see them bear fruit, trusting their children would. This patience is the essence of resilience, to build in hope, even when the past lies in ruin. In the ashes, hope smoldered quietly, waiting to grow. The ruins did not only represent endings, they became places of beginnings. New homes stood beside old walls, new shrines rose near fallen temples. Survivors lived not in despair, but in determination, weaving old and new into a fabric strong enough to carry them forward. Even as hardship lingered, joy found ways to endure. The laughter of children, the warmth of shared meals, the rhythm of festivals all became brighter against the backdrop of ashes. Life proved itself stronger than loss, whispering that collapse was never the end, only a transition. Over time, communities no longer saw the ashes as reminders of destruction, but as part of their inheritance. They were proof that their ancestors had endured, and so would they. Ashes turned from grief into grounding, a reminder that out of fire, life could always return. The story of life among the ashes teaches us that survival is not always dramatic. It is found in quiet meals, in shared labor, in whispered prayers. These small acts built the bridge from collapse to renewal. In them, humanity proved its greatest strength, the ability to continue. Life among the ashes shows us the essence of resilience. It was not the kings who preserved civilization, but the farmers, potters, weavers, and families who carried on. Their humble labor kept the spark alive, ensuring that from the ashes of collapse, the seeds of new societies would grow. The voices of survivors did not echo through stone inscriptions or royal decrees. They lived in stories told by firelight, in songs passed from parent to child, and in memories whispered during long journeys. These voices remind us that history is not only about kings and empires, but about ordinary people who endured, rebuilt, and carried memory forward. Around small fires in villages, elders spoke of the days when cities burned. They remembered the sound of walls collapsing, the cries of families fleeing, the hunger that followed. These stories were told with sorrow, but also with pride. For to survive was itself an act of resilience, a quiet triumph in the face of chaos. Children grew up listening to these tales. For them, the ruins they played in were filled with voices of the past. Their imaginations turned broken walls into fortresses and cracked streets into paths of heroes. The voice of survivors shaped their identity, teaching them that their community was not born in wealth but in endurance. Songs carried the memory of collapse. Simple melodies repeated through generations, speaking of storms, fire, and wandering. Even when the words shifted, the essence remained. A memory of loss carried by rhythm. Music became both a comfort and a vessel, ensuring the past was never forgotten. In myths, the voices of survivors found new form. Heroes wandered seas, cities fell by divine will, gods tested mortals with trials. Behind these stories lay memories of real events, reshaped by imagination. Survivors spoke truth through symbols, their lived experiences woven into timeless legend. Some voices were preserved in clay. Letters from Ugrit, unfinished and desperate, cried out for help that never came. These words, never delivered, became the testimony of survivors whose cities fell. Though their names are lost, their fears remain clear, etched in fragile tablets baked by fire. Other voices remain in the soil. The way fields were replanted, the way houses rose on burned foundations, the way pottery styles shifted. These silent changes are also voices. They speak not in words, but in actions, showing us how survivors adapted, quietly, to new realities. The voice of survivors was not always mournful. They also spoke of renewal, of families returning to farms, of neighbors rebuilding walls, of festivals revived in smaller but determined ways. Their stories did not end with collapse, but began again with resilience. In their voices we hear both grief and hope. Stories of migration also carried memory. Families told of seas crossed, of lands sought, of trials endured. These tales reminded children that they were descendants of wanderers, people who had walked through fire and storm yet found new homes. To remember migration was to remember strength. The voice of survivors shaped cultural identity. Communities came to define themselves not by kings but by what they had endured. To be Philistine, Israelite, or Phoenician was to inherit not only land but memory. Survival became the shared story, binding people more tightly than conquest ever had. Some stories warned of arrogance. Survivors spoke of how kings had trusted too much in walls, armies, and wealth. Their downfall became a lesson, that no power is eternal, and that humility is the path to endurance. These voices became moral guides, shaping the values of new societies. In quiet rituals, survivors honored ancestors who had fallen. Names were whispered, offerings made at simple shrines. Even when temples lay in ruin, memory remained alive in gestures of respect. These acts carried voices across generations, ensuring the dead were never entirely silent. The voices of survivors also taught resilience through laughter. In songs and tales, humor softened pain. Stories of mistakes, of foolish leaders, of narrow escapes, brought smiles even in hardship. Survival was not only endurance, but the ability to find light in darkness. As centuries passed, the voices grew layered. New generations added their own experiences of struggle, blending them with the memories of collapse. The result was a tapestry of story, part history, part legend, part lesson. Through it, survivors remained alive in memory, never lost to silence. Archaeologists today uncover fragments of these voices. Charred remains, rebuilt homes, shifting tools, each is a word in the language of survival. To read them is to listen across millennia, hearing the quiet determination of those who refused to vanish. The voice of survivors also changed the meaning of heroism. No longer just kings or warriors, but farmers, mothers, and children became the true heroes. Their simple acts of persistence plowing, weaving, singing were what carried societies through collapse. In their voices, everyday life became epic. Myths of wandering heroes, like Odysseus or Aeneas, may echo these real voices. Survivors who lost homes and traveled seas told of exile and return, of trials and renewal. Their personal journeys inspired stories that grew into epics, giving immortal shape to the struggles of the many. Even silence was a kind of voice. Empty palaces, abandoned roads, collapsed archives all spoke of what was lost. Survivors lived in landscapes filled with absence, and that absence itself became part of memory. Silence carried as much weight as speech. The voice of survivors was not always one of lament. It also carried gratitude for food shared, for children born, for mornings when fields bore grain again. These small blessings became songs of thanks, sung not in temples but in fields and homes, woven into the rhythm of life. Through trade, survivors carried their voices farther. Pottery designs, weaving patterns, and tools bore traces of their past, spreading stories without words. Every shard unearthed tells of survival, a silent yet eloquent expression of what communities endured and created. The voices also reached forward in time. Later, societies inherited them as myths, histories, and sacred texts. Though reshaped, they carried the same essence: the resilience of people who lived through collapse. In this way, survivors continued to speak long after their names were forgotten. The echo of their voices reminds us that history is not only kings and battles, but also families and neighbors. Their words may be soft, but they endure longer than decrees carved in stone. For in memory, it is survival itself that speaks most strongly. Survivors knew that collapse was not the end. Their voices taught patience, humility, and endurance. They carried wisdom through sorrow, reminding future generations that even in ashes, life can grow again. Their testimony was not grand, but it was true. The voice of survivors is the heart of history. It is the murmur of resilience, the whisper of endurance, the song of life continuing. It reminds us that even when empires fall, humanity endures, not through crowns and armies, but through the quiet persistence of those who choose to keep living. As we listen to the voice of survivors, we hear our own reflection. Their struggles mirror ours, their endurance offers comfort, their memory guides. History for Sleep becomes not only a story of collapse, but a story of continuity, reminding us that survival is itself the most powerful voice of all. When the great networks of the Bronze Age collapsed, trade did not vanish entirely. It shrank, shifted, and reshaped itself into humbler patterns. Gone were the fleets crossing seas with cargoes of copper and tin. Gone were the caravans linking distant palaces. In their place came smaller exchanges, carried on the backs of donkeys or in the holds of modest fishing boats. Villages that once relied on exotic goods now turned to neighbors for what they lacked. Grain was swapped for oil, wool traded for pottery, and salt exchanged for fish. These transactions were simple, but they stitched communities together. New bonds grew not from kings' treaties, but from the daily needs of ordinary people. The harbors of the Mediterranean, once filled with grand ships, became quieter. Yet small vessels still set sail, hugging coastlines rather than venturing into open seas. Their cargoes were lighter, their journeys shorter, but they carried life. The sea remained a link, even if its reach was now far more modest. Markets grew smaller, but more personal. Instead of bustling squares filled with merchants from across the world, villages held modest gatherings. Farmers sold produce, shepherds traded cheese, potters offered jars. These markets lacked the glitter of empire, but carried the warmth of familiarity, where neighbors bartered face to face. In Cyprus, once the hub of copper trade, smaller workshops continued to smelt ore. Without vast demand, their production slowed, yet it did not stop. Copper ingots were still shaped and exchanged locally, fueling the needs of nearby communities. The island adapted, shifting from international supplier to regional contributor. Egypt, too, adjusted its role. No longer feeding distant allies with its grain, it turned inward, supplying its own people. Yet small exchanges still moved outward. Merchants carried papyrus, linen, and grain across nearby coasts. Egypt's trade became regional, less about empire, more about survival. The Phoenicians thrived in this environment. With their nimble ships and skilled seamanship, they navigated shorter but steady routes. They traded timber, purple dye, and crafted goods, building influence not through conquest but through persistence. In the gaps left by fallen empires, they became the new lifeblood of Mediterranean trade. For ordinary people, these new patterns of trade meant fewer luxuries but more resilience. No longer dependent on distant imports, they turned to local resources. Tools and pottery were simpler, but communities were steadier. Survival was found not in abundance but in adaptability. Archaeology reveals this shift clearly. Imported luxury ceramics disappear, replaced by local imitations. Storage jars, cooking pots, and plain vessels dominate, reflecting practical needs. Yet in their simplicity, these objects speak of survival, showing how trade adjusted to smaller scales. Overland routes also changed. Instead of long caravans stretching across continents, shorter journeys connected nearby towns. Donkeys carried salt, wool, or grain along familiar paths. These roads may have grown quieter, but they still hummed with life, carrying goods that sustained local economies. New currencies of exchange emerged. Where once gold and silver dominated, now barter grew stronger. A jar of oil might be traded for a measure of grain, a woven cloth for a goat. Value became personal, negotiated face to face, reflecting the immediate needs of both parties. This shift also altered social relationships. Trade was no longer managed by distant kings but by families and individuals. Trust and reputation became more important than royal decrees. Communities grew closer, bound not by empire but by direct exchange. The decline of large-scale trade also encouraged innovation. Without access to distant tin, blacksmiths turned increasingly to iron. Local materials replaced imports, fostering experimentation. This practical shift laid the groundwork for the Iron Age, born out of necessity and resilience. Seafaring itself changed character. Instead of long voyages into unknown waters, ships hugged the coast, stopping at many small ports. Each harbor became part of a chain, linking villages step by step. Trade was slower, but also safer, grounded in smaller, reliable journeys. Festivals and gatherings often doubled as markets. Communities met not only to celebrate, but to exchange goods. Such moments strengthened both social and economic ties, ensuring survival was woven into culture itself. The rhythm of trade was now the rhythm of community life. Some goods still traveled long distances, though rarely. A piece of ivory, a gemstone, or a fine textile might pass from hand to hand, slowly making its way across regions. These rare items became even more prized. Symbols not only of wealth, but of connection to a wider world that still flickered beyond the horizon. The Phoenician alphabet, born in this age, helped trade revive. By simplifying writing, It allowed merchants to record transactions more easily. Words traveled with goods, ensuring memory and trust. In this way, new trade patterns carried not only objects, but also ideas, shaping the cultural fabric of the Iron Age. For communities, trade remained more than economy, it was connection. A jar exchanged at market was also a bond of trust, a promise of reciprocity. These small exchanges built networks of loyalty and friendship, creating resilience stronger than walls or armies. The echo of larger trade persisted in memory. Elders remembered the days when ships carried copper and gold across the seas. They spoke of it to children who grew up in humbler markets. The contrast taught humility, that trade could flourish, but could also falter, reminding all of life's fragility. In time, new routes slowly extended again. What began as local trade grew outward, village by village, harbor by harbor. Step by step, the Mediterranean reconnected, not with the grandeur of old, but with the steady resilience of small beginnings. These new patterns of trade also reshaped culture. Instead of empires dictating styles, local crafts flourished. Pottery bore regional designs, weaving carried village symbols, and music echoed distinct traditions. The diversity of culture grew richer in the absence of uniformity. The shift also carried environmental lessons. With less dependence on distant imports, communities lived closer to the land. They adjusted to their soil, their climate, their rivers. The balance between human need and natural resource grew more intimate, teaching a quieter form of sustainability. Even in collapse, trade never fully died. It bent, shrank, and transformed, but it endured. For trade is not only luxury, it is survival, the simple exchange of need for need. In its humbler form, it carried life across the ashes of empire. The new patterns of trade whisper a truth, that human connection cannot be broken entirely. Even when palaces fall and fleets vanish, people will always find ways to share, to barter, to sustain one another. In these quiet exchanges lay the endurance of civilization. As the Mediterranean shifted from grandeur to simplicity, trade became the thread that bound survivors together. It was no longer about wealth or power, but about resilience. From these smaller patterns grew the foundation of future networks, proving that even in collapse, the instinct to connect never disappears. When the world of empires collapsed, faith did not vanish. It changed its shape, finding new forms in smaller shrines, in household altars, and in whispered prayers. The gods who once stood in vast temples now dwelled closer to the hearth, closer to the rhythms of daily life. Religion adjusted to survival, reshaping itself to fit the fragile age. Grand temples that once echoed with chants and offerings now lay in ruins. In their place, families built small spaces of devotion, a stone set upright, a clay figure of a deity, a bowl of oil for fire. These simple objects carried as much meaning as statues of gold. Faith survived, even when the structures of worship did not. The gods themselves seemed to shift in character. Once patrons of mighty kings, they became guardians of households and fields. Farmers prayed for rain, shepherds for safe flocks, mothers for healthy children. The divine became more personal, less about empire, more about survival. Storm gods and sea gods gained greater weight in this new age. For communities living with the memory of famine, migration, and disaster, the powers of nature seemed immediate and unpredictable. Thunder and waves carried voices of the divine, demanding respect and offerings. The gods mirrored the turbulence of the world. At the same time, deities of fertility, harvest, and hearth held steady importance. To keep life going, people turned to symbols of growth and endurance. A seed sprouting in the soil, a loaf rising on the fire, a child born in hardship, each was seen as the gift of the divine, a sign that hope endured. The collapse blurred boundaries of worship. As migrants settled in new lands, they carried their gods with them. Some blended with local deities, others took on new forms. In this way, the pantheon of the Mediterranean became more diverse, a tapestry of gods reshaped by human movement and memory. Egypt preserved much of its traditional worship, yet even there, changes appeared. Temples continued their rituals, but resources grew thinner. Priests spoke more of divine favor, protecting Egypt from the chaos that consumed neighbors. The gods became symbols of continuity, anchoring the land even as the wider world shifted. In the Levant, new traditions formed. The Israelites emphasized a God who traveled with them, not bound to a palace or temple, but present in wandering. Their memory of migration shaped their faith, making it portable, resilient, and deeply tied to identity. The Philistines, linked with the sea peoples, brought new deities to the coastal plains. Their gods joined the local pantheon, influencing and influenced by neighbors. Religion reflected the blending of peoples, a spiritual mirror of cultural fusion. Faith became a dialogue across communities. For survivors, worship was both hope and explanation. Disasters were seen as punishments, survival as blessing. By offering prayers and sacrifices, people sought to understand the chaos of their time. Faith gave order where the world seemed broken, weaving meaning into hardship. The intimacy of religion gave comfort. Families could kneel at a small shrine within their home, whispering to gods they believed, listened directly. This closeness softened fear, reminding them that even in ruins, the divine was not absent. Faith had simply moved nearer. Festivals continued, though in smaller forms. Songs, dances, and offerings were made not in grand plazas, but in village squares and family courtyards. Yet the joy of celebrating gods endured. These moments affirmed community, reminding survivors that they were not alone, that the divine still walked among them. Myths adapted to explain collapse. Stories told of gods withdrawing favor, of arrogance punished, of lessons to be remembered. These tales were both warnings and comforts, shaping the worldview of new societies. Through them, faith became history's interpreter. Artifacts reveal these shifts. Small figurines of goddesses, carved amulets, and simple altars appear in the archaeological record. They lack grandeur, yet they reveal devotion. These objects show that the divine lived not only in temples, but in homes, carried in the daily lives of survivors. The gods of a changing world were not abandoned, they were reimagined. Migrants brought their faith to new lands, blending traditions. Villagers created rituals suited to their new realities. In every case, worship endured, proving that belief is as adaptable as the people who carry it. Religion also provided resilience through memory. By linking themselves to the gods of their ancestors, survivors felt continuity. Even when everything else had fallen, the divine connected past and present. This thread gave strength, reminding them they were not the first to endure hardship. For some, faith deepened in intimacy. Without temples, the hearth became sacred. The simple act of lighting a fire or baking bread carried spiritual meaning. The divine was no longer distant, but woven into the quiet rituals of daily life. In this way, collapse drew gods closer. In coastal towns, sailors prayed to see gods before venturing out, offering shells, fish, or small idols. Their lives depended on winds and waves, and faith provided both courage and humility. Religion guided not only survival on land, but also the uncertain journeys across water. In fields, farmers left offerings at the edges of their crops, believing spirits would protect the harvest. These gestures, small yet sincere, reflect how faith met the most immediate needs. Every loaf of bread became a reminder of divine presence, every harvest a sacred gift. The gods of a changing world also traveled through story. Tales of divine intervention, of blessings and punishments, moved with migrants. These stories not only preserved faith, but carried identity, ensuring that displaced people did not lose themselves in new lands. Faith was memory made sacred. Even silence could feel divine. In ruins where temples once stood, survivors felt presence in absence. The broken columns and empty halls seemed filled with unseen voices. For them, the gods had not died. They had simply changed their dwelling, still watching, still near. Faith was also a way of facing uncertainty. By placing their struggles into divine hands, survivors could bear hardship with meaning. They believed that gods guided, tested, or protected them. In this trust, they found strength to continue when everything else seemed fragile. The gods of a changing world remind us that belief is never fixed. It shifts, bends, and adapts to human need. The collapse of temples did not end religion, it made it more personal, more resilient, and more deeply rooted in survival. Religion became a thread of continuity in a fractured world. It linked survivors to ancestors, migrants to new lands, and families to one another. In the quiet rituals of homes, the divine remained alive, ensuring that collapse was never the end of faith, only its transformation. The gods of a changing world whisper that belief is as enduring as humanity itself. When walls fall, when cities burn, faith takes root in ashes. It is carried in stories, in rituals, in hope. Through change, gods remain, reshaped but present, guiding people into new dawns. When empires fell silent, languages too began to shift. The voices that once carried across courts and embassies faded with the fall of palaces. Yet speech never disappeared, adapted. In the ruins of the Bronze Age, new tongues took root, carrying both echoes of the past and seeds of the future. Scribes once wrote in complex scripts, chiseling cuneiform or inscribing hieroglyphs for kings and gods. But when archives burned and schools of scribes closed, literacy narrowed. Writing gave way to spoken word, and memory traveled in voices instead of clay. The people did not forget. They simply spoke their history aloud. In villages, dialects flourished. Without central palaces enforcing official tongues, local speech grew freer. Words blended from neighbors, migrants, and strangers. New dialects were born in the meeting places of survivors, each carrying the sound of both heritage and change. Language lived in every conversation, every lullaby, every prayer. Some languages vanished with the fall of cities. The Hittite tongue, once spoken across Anatolia, grew quiet as its capital crumbled. Others endured, reshaped in smaller communities, preserved by farmers and shepherds, who carried them into new generations. Each language's survival depended not on kings, but on the persistence of families. From these shifting voices, new forms of writing emerged. The Phoenician alphabet, simple and adaptable, spread across coasts and islands. Unlike cuneiform, it could be learned quickly, written easily on papyrus or parchment. This quiet innovation allowed small traders and ordinary people to record their words, planting the roots of literacy for ages to come. The alphabet carried old echoes. Each letter had once been a picture, simplified over time until it became a symbol. What had begun as images of oxen, houses, or water became abstract forms, but the memory of origins remained. In every letter was both past and present, old shapes echoing in new voices. Trade carried these new scripts outward. As merchants exchanged goods, they also exchanged words. Alphabets spread with ships, carving their place on tablets, amphorae, and walls. The languages of villages became the languages of harbors, reaching farther than their speakers ever dreamed. Oral tradition filled the gaps where writing had disappeared. Poems, songs, and proverbs became the libraries of memory. Storytellers preserved the past with rhythm and rhyme, easier to recall in times without books. These oral echoes ensured that collapse did not silence knowledge, only changed the way it was carried. In Greece, writing disappeared with the fall of Mycenaean palaces, yet memory endured in song. Centuries later, the epics of Homer would rise from these oral traditions, carrying echoes of the Bronze Age. The loss of script became the birth of literature, shaping identity through voice rather than clay. Migration blended languages further. Displaced peoples carried their speech into new lands, mixing with locals. The result was hybrid tongues, layered with words from many origins. These languages tell us that identity was not fixed but evolving, shaped by the journeys of survivors. Religion too reflected this shift. Names of gods changed, merging from one tongue to another. A storm god in one land became a thunder god in another. His name altered, but his essence recognized. The divine crossed languages, ensuring continuity even as words transformed. In daily life, children became the keepers of change. They learned the words of parents, but also picked up the dialect of neighbors. Their speech blended worlds together, creating new tongues that would one day become standard. Through children, language carried both memory and adaptation. The echoes of old tongues lived on in borrowed words. A phrase from a fallen empire might remain in farming terms, in tools, or in songs. Even if a language died, fragments survived, stitched into the speech of the living. These fragments are fossils of sound, preserved in the flow of time. For travelers, language became both barrier and bridge. A merchant entering a new port might struggle with unfamiliar words, yet trade required understanding. Gestures, shared phrases, and borrowed vocabulary smoothed exchanges. In this way, necessity encouraged the blending of speech. The Phoenicians carried more than goods, they carried their script across seas. From their alphabet grew Greek letters, and from Greek letters, Latin. From those roots, countless modern languages trace their lineage. The collapse of one system gave rise to another, a legacy written not in stone but in sound. Old echoes also lingered in myth. Stories carried ancient names and words, even when their meanings were forgotten. A hero's name might preserve a vanished tongue. A place name might whisper of an older people. In legend, languages survived long after they were no longer spoken. In some lands, inscriptions grew humbler. Instead of royal decrees, graffiti scratched into walls told of daily lives. Names, prayers, and simple accounts replaced grand proclamations. Language had moved from palace to street, from archive to household, more democratic, more personal. The diversity of tongues reflected resilience. No single language dominated, many coexisted. This fragmentation was not weakness, but adaptation, ensuring that even if one speech vanished, others would carry life forward. The human voice proved more enduring than empire. Archaeologists find these echoes in shards and stones. Inscriptions, half broken, still reveal alphabets in transition. Words scratched into pottery or carved into rock show us how survivors spoke, prayed, and remembered. Even the smallest mark is an echo of a voice once alive. The shift in language also changed memory. Oral stories emphasized emotion, rhythm, and lesson, rather than precise detail. History became more poetic, less factual, but also more enduring. These echoes carried meaning through centuries, teaching not through record but through resonance. New tongues gave identity to new peoples. Philistines, Phoenicians, Israelites, soul grew distinct, in part through language. Speech separated communities, but it also bound them internally, shaping belonging and heritage. To speak a tongue was to be part of a story larger than oneself. The echoes of old tongues remind us that language is never still. It bends, blends, and reshapes itself with every generation. Collapse did not silence voices, it multiplied them, scattering words into new forms that carried both memory and transformation. For the survivors, speech was power. To name the land, to pray, to tell a story, these acts ensured continuity. Writing might fade, but words endured, flowing from lips to ears, from parent to child. Language was the unbroken thread, carrying humanity through collapse. New tongues, old echoes. This is the legacy of language in the age of ruins. Words changed, scripts transformed, but the voice of humanity endured. In every whispered story, in every borrowed phrase, in every carved symbol, the past still speaks. Through language, collapse was never silence, but transformation. When the Sea Peoples first appeared, they were remembered as destroyers. Inscriptions carved by pharaohs and letters written by desperate kings described them as enemies from the sea. They arrived with ships and weapons, leaving fire and ruin in their wake. Yet history rarely ends in a single image. Over time, some who came as raiders remained as neighbors, reshaping the lands they once unsettled. Archaeology tells this story in quiet detail. In the layers above burned ruins, new settlements appear. Pottery styles shift, houses take new shapes, and burial practices change. These traces reveal that those once feared as invaders eventually laid down roots, farming fields and raising families in the very lands they had once attacked. The Philistines in Canaan are the clearest example. Linked by scholars to the Peleset of Egyptian records, they settled along the coastal plain after being turned back from Egypt. Within a few generations, they were no longer wanderers, but city builders, leaving behind pottery, architecture, and traditions that blended their origins with local culture. The transformation from raider to neighbor was not simple. It required tension, negotiation, and time. At first, the newcomers must have seemed threatening, their customs strange, their language foreign. Yet as seasons passed and children were born on the soil, they became part of the landscape, no longer outsiders but inhabitants. Local populations faced choices. They could resist, fight, or flee. They could adapt. In many cases, coexistence was the most practical path. Farmers might exchange goods with newcomers, soldiers might serve alongside them, and marriages might link families. In this way, hostility softened into uneasy cooperation, then into familiarity. The Sea Peoples carried crafts and skills into their new homes. Their pottery styles, with distinctive decorations, spread across coastal settlements. Their weapon designs influenced local armories. Over time, these contributions merged with native traditions, creating a hybrid culture that bore the mark of both raider and host. Religion, too, adapted. New gods were carried into the Levant, joining or blending with local deities. In temples and shrines, offerings reflected both traditions. Spiritual life mirrored cultural life, a fusion of practices that reshaped identity, turning difference into shared heritage. The image of the Sea Peoples as destroyers was preserved in the records of their enemies, but within their own communities, the story was likely different. They would have spoken of survival, of finding land for their families, of beginning again. In this way, memory itself was divided: threat to some, renewal to others. As generations passed, the label of outsider faded. Children born in new settlements knew no other homeland. Their identity was shaped not by migration but by the soil beneath their feet. In this way, the Sea Peoples became locals, inheritors of the land they once entered as strangers. Other groups followed similar paths. Sheridan, Shekolesh, and others mentioned in Egyptian records may also have found new roots, though their traces are less visible. Whether in islands, coastal towns, or inland valleys, the pattern repeated: raiders transforming into neighbors, violence yielding to settlement. This transformation is a reminder of the fluid nature of identity. A group feared in one generation may be part of the community in the next. The line between enemy and neighbor is thin, shaped by time, need, and adaptation. The story of the Sea Peoples illustrates how history rarely has fixed categories. Archaeological evidence of diet shows this change clearly. At first, newcomers ate differently, bringing foods and cooking styles from their homelands. But gradually, they adopted local crops, livestock, and culinary traditions. Shared meals became shared culture, one of the quietest but most enduring forms of assimilation. Trade accelerated this blending. Farmers and fishers exchanged goods across communities. Newcomers provided skills or surplus harvests, while locals shared knowledge of the land. Commerce softened divisions, turning former enemies into economic partners. Markets became places where identities mixed as easily as goods. Even conflict played a role in shaping identity. Skirmishes and rivalries did not prevent coexistence. They simply defined the terms of it. Boundaries were drawn, alliances made and broken, but the very act of enduring side by side forced adaptation. Out of friction came a kind of balance. Stories of origin began to change. What had been remembered as migration or conquest became mythologized as ancestry. Families spoke of grandfathers who came from across the sea, of founders who braved storms to reach new lands. What once was invasion became heritage, transformed by the passage of time. The process of becoming neighbors reshaped both sides. Locals influenced newcomers as much as newcomers influenced locals. Together they built new traditions, blending languages, faiths, and customs. Out of tension came hybridity, a cultural mosaic born of necessity and survival. By the Iron Age, many of these groups were no longer distinguishable as outsiders. They were woven into the societies around them, their unique origins remembered in fragments, but their lives fully part of local history. Raiders had become ancestors, their memory reshaped into belonging. This pattern is not unique to the Sea Peoples. Across history, migration often begins in fear and conflict, but ends in integration. The lesson of from raider to neighbor is one of humanity's recurring truths, that strangers eventually become part of the story, part of the community. For the survivors of the Bronze Age collapse, this transformation carried meaning. It showed that even in an age of chaos, people could adapt and enemies could become allies. What began in fire ended in coexistence, proving that life is stronger than conflict. In archaeology, the blending is visible in every layer. Pottery decorated with both foreign and local designs, houses built in mixed styles, tools shaped by combined traditions. These fragments reveal not conquest alone, but cooperation, a merging that gave birth to new identities. The story of raiders becoming neighbors is also the story of survival. For those who left their homelands, settling was the only way forward. For those who endured invasion, adaptation was the key to continuity. Together, these choices ensured that communities lived on, reshaped but enduring. This legacy endures in myth and scripture. The Philistines appear as adversaries in biblical texts, yet archaeology shows them as part of the land's culture. Their dual images, both outsider and neighbor, captures the tension of their transformation. History preserves both sides of the story. From raider to neighbor, the Sea Peoples illustrate that collapse does not only bring destruction, it brings renewal through blending, through coexistence, through the quiet work of living side by side. Their journey from feared invaders to settled communities is one of history's gentlest reminders that even out of chaos, belonging can be born. As we reflect on this transformation, we see that survival is not only about walls and weapons, it is also about openness, adaptation, and the slow weaving of strangers into neighbors. The Sea Peoples, once shadows on the horizon, became voices in the community. Their story teaches that identity, like history itself, is always in motion. The end of the Bronze Age did not only mark destruction, it also marked the beginning of something new. Out of scarcity came innovation, and out of necessity came change. As bronze grew harder to obtain, iron stepped forward as the metal of survival. What began as a substitute became the foundation of an entire new era. Bronze had been the glory of empires, but it required tin, a metal rare and imported from distant lands. When trade collapsed, tin became scarce. Copper still flowed from places like Cyprus, but without tin, bronze could not be made in abundance. Communities searched for alternatives, and their eyes turned to iron. Iron was not new. Blacksmiths had experimented with it before, often in small amounts, but it had been considered inferior, harder to smelt, and less glamorous than bronze. Only when bronze became scarce did iron's true potential reveal itself. Out of difficulty, its value emerged. Iron was everywhere, in rocks, in soil, in veins beneath the earth. Unlike tin, it did not require long voyages or distant mines. The challenge lay in mastering the fire hot enough to shape it. When smiths learned this skill, they unlocked a resource more abundant than anything the Bronze Age had known. The first iron tools were simple plows, sickles, knives. Farmers quickly saw their advantage. Iron blades cut deeper, lasted longer, and could be sharpened with ease. Fields grew more productive, and agriculture gained new strength. Iron did not just arm warriors, it fed societies. Weapons too changed. Iron swords were harder than bronze, able to withstand repeated blows. Spears and arrowheads tipped with iron pierced more effectively. Armies armed with iron became stronger, shifting the balance of power between communities. A quiet revolution in metallurgy became a revolution in survival. The spread of iron was uneven at first. Some regions adopted it quickly, while others clung to bronze as long as they could, but the direction was inevitable. As generations passed, iron became the standard, shaping both war and peace. The world had entered a new age without realizing it at first. The dawn of iron was not only technological, it was cultural. Blacksmiths gained new importance, their skills vital for both farming and defense. Villagers honored them as craftsmen of transformation, those who could turn stone into strength. Their forges became centers of life, glowing with the fire of renewal. In some myths, echoes of this transformation can be heard. Stories of gods, of fire, of forges and hammers may reflect the growing power of smiths. Communities may have seen them as working with divine flame, reshaping Earth's hidden gifts into tools of survival. Iron carried spiritual weight as well as practical use. The abundance of iron also reshaped economies. Where once metal had been limited to elites, now more people could access tools and weapons. Power became less concentrated, more widely distributed. This shift altered social balance, giving strength to smaller communities that once relied on distant kings. Trade adapted around iron, or was mined locally, reducing dependence on long-distance exchange. Blacksmiths became traveling specialists, carrying skills from village to village. Iron spread, not by vast empires, but by countless small fires burning in humble workshops across the land. The arrival of iron also reshaped warfare. Armies grew larger as weapons became easier to produce. Defense was no longer limited to elite charioteers, armed with costly bronze. Ordinary soldiers could now be equipped, changing the very nature of conflict. Battles became more personal, fought with weapons forged by neighbors. Agriculture benefited even more profoundly. Iron plows cut through tougher soil, opening land once too difficult to farm. Fields expanded, harvests grew, and populations increased. This agricultural boost supported the rise of new societies in the Iron Age, nourished by stronger tools. In Cyprus, Anatolia, and Greece, ironworking developed in unique ways. Each region experimented, refining techniques suited to local needs. From these diverse beginnings, a shared revolution emerged, spreading across the Mediterranean. The dawn of iron was not one invention, but many, discovered and rediscovered by countless hands. The Phoenicians helped spread iron technology through trade. As their ships carried timber and dye, they also carried tools and weapons. The knowledge of smelting and forging passed from one coast to another, carried not only in objects, but in the skills of smiths. Iron became part of the cultural exchange of the new age. For survivors of the collapse, iron symbolized renewal. While ruins spoke of loss, iron tools spoke of progress. Each plow, each sword, each hammer was a declaration that life had not ended, that humanity was learning, adapting, and moving forward. Iron carried the promise of endurance. The dawn of iron was slow, but unstoppable. With each generation, bronze grew rarer and iron more common. The old metal of kings became the new metal of villagers. This shift was not only practical but symbolic. Power had passed from empires to communities, from palaces to forges. Iron also carried risks. Stronger weapons meant harsher wars. Conflicts could be deadlier, armies more destructive. Yet, at the same time, stronger plows meant fuller harvests. Better tools meant sturdier homes. Iron was both danger and blessing, as powerful as the hands that wielded it. The shift to iron also changed landscapes. Forests were cut for charcoal to feed furnaces. Mines scarred the earth as ore was extracted. Human activity grew more intense, reshaping environments as societies learned to harness this new resource. The dawn of iron was also the dawn of deeper human impact. For many communities, iron became part of identity. A village might be known for its smiths, another for its mines, another for its warriors armed in new metal. These specializations wove into cultural memory, defining places for centuries to come. Iron gave communities both strength and character. Archaeologists find iron objects where once only bronze existed. The layers of time reveal the transition. Bronze blades beside iron knives, copper vessels beside iron plows. Each object tells the story of adaptation, of people who embraced change in order to endure. The dawn of iron also ensured that the memory of collapse was not only sorrow, it carried hope, proof that even in destruction, new discoveries can rise. From scarcity came abundance, from weakness came strength. The shift to iron is a reminder that history's endings are also beginnings. In myth and memory, this age was remembered as a time of rebirth. Heroes wielded iron swords, gods blessed smiths with fire, and farmers prospered with new tools. The stories of survival blended with the reality of innovation, giving the Iron Age both legend and truth. For the sleepless historian listening now, the dawn of iron is a gentle reminder of resilience. It shows that even when the old ways fail, humanity can adapt. The forge glows, the hammer strikes, and from raw earth comes strength. Out of collapse, new light rises, carrying us quietly into the future. The Bronze Age had ended, but life endured. In every village where iron was shaped, the future took form. The dawn of iron was not loud, it was steady, persistent, and transformative. It was the sound of hammers echoing in the night, guiding humanity into a new age. When archives crumbled and palaces burned, memory did not vanish. It lived on in stories told by survivors, in songs sung by children, and in whispers carried through generations. The resilience of memory ensured that even when writing fell silent, history continued to breathe in human voices. Memory is more flexible than stone. Temples may collapse and tablets may shatter, but stories adapt, traveling with people wherever they go. Around hearthfires and along trade routes, survivors retold the past. Their words became both anchor and compass, guiding them through uncertain times. In Greece, the absence of writing gave rise to oral epics. Bards recited long tales of heroes, wars, and journeys, weaving fragments of real memory into the fabric of legend. The Iliad and Odyssey, shaped centuries later, carried echoes of this age of collapse, preserving truth inside poetry. The Levant, too, preserved its memory in sacred texts. The stories of wandering peoples, of battles for land, of exile and return, may reflect the lived experiences of those who endured the Bronze Age's end. Though written later, these traditions carry the emotional truth of survival. Egypt recorded its victories over the sea peoples, carving them into stone. But even these official inscriptions are memory-shaped, selective, purposeful. They remind us that every act of remembrance is also interpretation. Memory survives, but always colored by those who carry it forward. Communities turned ruins into memorials. Broken walls became places of story, where elders explained how the city had fallen. Children grew up learning not only the names of ancestors, but the lessons of fragility. The stones themselves became silent teachers, shaping cultural identity. The resilience of memory lies in its adaptability. A story of famine might become a tale of divine punishment. A story of migration might become a myth of heroic wandering. Memory reshaped itself to fit the needs of each generation, ensuring it was never forgotten but always relevant. Archaeology reveals this process. Pottery designs carry echoes of older traditions, even as new styles emerge. Burial practices blend old customs with new influences. These small details are material memory, continuity preserved in clay, stone, and ritual. They show that people remembered not only in words but in deeds. Festivals kept memory alive as well. Even when temples were gone, communities gathered to mark seasons, harvests, and ancestral rites. In song and dance, they carried forward the essence of their past. These traditions outlasted palaces, binding generations in rhythm and ritual. Memory also carried warnings. Survivors spoke of arrogance punished, of kings who thought themselves eternal but fell in fire. These cautionary tales were repeated not just to recall the past but to shape the future. In memory, collapse became lesson, guiding choices for generations to come. At the same time, memory gave comfort. To remember ancestors was to feel their presence, to believe they still guided and protected. Even in exile or hardship, memory tied communities to their roots. It offered belonging when lands were lost, a sense of continuity in a fractured world. The resilience of memory shows in how myths preserve fragments of fact. Tales of cities destroyed by divine wrath may echo real destruction. Legends of floods or famines may carry echoes of climate shifts. The details blur, but the essence survives, transformed into story that endures beyond archives. Some memories were carried in objects. Amulets, family heirlooms, or tools passed down became vessels of remembrance. A pot shaped in the old style, a bead carved with ancient symbols, reminded survivors of who they were. These objects whispered memory across centuries. Migration spread memory across new lands. Families displaced by collapse carried their stories with them, planting fragments of their past into new soils. Even when they blended with locals, their memory influenced culture, shaping traditions in subtle but lasting ways. The resilience of memory also ensured identity. Communities defined themselves not only by where they lived, but by what they remembered. To share stories of origin was to belong. Memory became the thread that wove people together, stronger than walls, stronger than kings. Not all memory survived unchanged. Some was lost, some reshaped beyond recognition. Yet even fragments carried power. A name preserved, a song half remembered, a ritual adapted doors served to link the present with the past. Memory endured even when incomplete. Memory was also written into landscapes. Fields replanted where palaces had stood, shrines rebuilt on ruins, villages forming beside collapsed cities, was a form of remembering. The land itself carried continuity, its scars and uses binding generations together. In time, memory became identity for new societies. Greeks looked back to an age of heroes, Hebrews to an age of wandering, Egyptians to an age of divine protection. Each memory reflected not just the past, but the values and hopes of those who carried it. The resilience of memory is why we still speak of the Sea Peoples today. Though they left no written records of their own, their impact was preserved in Egyptian carvings, in Philistine pottery, and in biblical stories. They live on not because they wrote, but because others remembered. This endurance shows us that history is never truly lost. Even when archives crumble, memory adapts. It finds new vessels, new voices, new ways to endure. What matters is not the survival of every detail, but the persistence of meaning. For the sleepless listener, memory itself is a comfort. It reminds us that nothing is entirely gone, that echoes remain even when silence seems complete. To remember is to honor, to keep alive what might otherwise fade. Memory is survival in its gentlest form. Archaeologists uncover memory in layers of earth. Every shard, every tool, every inscription is a fragment of human recollection. To study them is to listen to voices carried through time, whispers of people who endured. Their resilience lives in every artifact. The resilience of memory teaches humility. It shows us that archives and monuments may fail, but stories endure. The true strength of history lies not in what is written, but in what is remembered and retold. In memory, collapse is never the end. As we reflect on the resilience of memory, we find comfort. It tells us that even in loss, something remains. Even in silence, echoes continue. Memory bridges past and present, carrying humanity forward with whispers stronger than stone. The Bronze Age collapse ended kingdoms, but memory survived them. It endured in song, in myth, in object, and in land. Through memory, the people of that age continued to live, long after their palaces crumbled. Their resilience is not only in survival, but in remembrance. The story of the Sea Peoples and the fall of ancient empires leaves us with ruins, legends, and unanswered questions. Yet within this silence lies a legacy. The collapse did not erase humanity, it transformed it. The quiet legacy of this era is the reminder that even in great disruption, people adapt, endure, and shape new worlds from the ashes of the old. The ruins of Ugarit, Hattusa, and Mycenae whisper of lives once lived in splendor and then lost to fire. Yet, alongside these silent stones grew new voices, communities who built anew with smaller means but steady hearts. Their legacy was not palaces of stone, but resilience itself, carried forward generation after generation. The Sea Peoples, remembered as destroyers, also left behind the imprint of settlers. Their migrations reshaped coastlines, introduced crafts, and planted cultural seeds. Though they never wrote their own history, their presence is etched in pottery, weapons, and the traditions of those who came after them. Egypt, though strained, preserved its memory in monumental reliefs. These carvings remind us of survival, of holding fast against waves of change. Egypt's ability to endure while others crumbled became part of its lasting imagery. Land touched by turmoil, yet still rooted in the Nile's eternal rhythm. The collapse of trade networks teaches us the fragility of connection. Interdependence brought wealth and strength, but it also carried risk. The quiet legacy here is awareness that the systems humans build are strong yet delicate, able to flourish for centuries, but vulnerable to sudden unraveling. In the Levant, the rise of the Phoenicians after the collapse reflects continuity through change. Their seafaring skill grew in the spaces left open by fallen powers, spreading influence across the Mediterranean. Their alphabet, born from these centuries, would echo into countless languages, including our own. Greece, in its so-called Dark Age, planted the seeds of later brilliance. The oral traditions that preserved the memory of collapse became the foundation of epic poetry, philosophy, and democracy. The quiet centuries were not empty but fertile, nurturing ideas that would bloom in later ages. The highlands of Canaan gave rise to new communities, remembered in biblical tradition. Their quiet persistence, carved into hillsides and stories, shows how small societies can shape cultural memory more lastingly than great empires. Out of obscurity came identities that endured to this day. Cyprus, too, carried its legacy forward. Its mines once fueled the Bronze Age system, and after collapse, it absorbed new settlers and reshaped itself. The blending of traditions there is a quiet example of how cultures survive by embracing change rather than resisting it. The legacy is also technological. The shift from bronze to iron, born of necessity, carried humanity into a new era. Iron tools and weapons changed agriculture, warfare, and daily life. The collapse forced innovation, and innovation became the foundation of the Iron Age world. Even myths hold legacy. Stories of wandering, exile, and return remind us of how deeply the collapse imprinted itself on human imagination. From Homer's epics to biblical narratives, the memory of upheaval transformed into tales of meaning, still told and studied today. The Sea Peoples remain mysterious, yet their mystery is itself part of their legacy. By eluding complete understanding, they remind us that history is never fully known, that the past holds shadows as well as light. Their story invites humility, patience, and wonder in the face of what cannot be fully explained. The collapse showed that power can fade quickly, but resilience endures quietly. While palaces crumbled, farmers planted again, potters shaped clay, and shepherds led flocks. The legacy is not only in monuments, but in the persistence of daily life, unbroken by fire or famine. Inscriptions and ruins are fragments, yet they speak to us across 3 millennia. They tell us that civilizations may fall, but humanity always finds a way forward. The quiet legacy is continuity, the thread that carries human life across ages, even when the pattern of history is broken. The fall of great empires also reminds us of the value of smaller societies. Without the grandeur of kings, communities endured through cooperation, kinship, and shared labor. Their survival was quieter than conquest, yet more enduring in its simplicity. The Bronze Age collapse is often described as catastrophe, yet its legacy is not only ruin, but rebirth. The Iron Age emerged from its ashes, carrying forward new technologies, cultures, and ideas. Out of collapse, humanity found a path to begin again. Even the silence left behind is meaningful. Where archives stopped, stories began. Where letters ceased, songs rose. Memory survived in new forms, proving that history is never fully lost, only transformed. Waiting to be uncovered in ruins or whispered in legend, the collapse also offers perspective for our own times. It shows that systems, however grand, can falter, but that resilience lies in adaptation. The quiet legacy is a reminder that survival comes not from strength alone, but from flexibility, community, and the will to endure. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal new details, yet the broad shape of the story remains timeless. Cities may burn, but people endure. Networks may collapse, but connections return. From fragility comes renewal, and from loss comes transformation. The legacy is also one of humility. The people of the late Bronze Age thought their empires eternal, yet within a generation many were gone. Their story reminds us that history is fragile, and that endurance cannot be measured in monuments alone, but in the quiet strength of ordinary lives. The quiet legacy whispers in the waves that still wash the shores of the Mediterranean. The sea that carried both merchants and migrants continues to connect lands and peoples. In its endless rhythm, it carries echoes of those who once crossed it in search of survival. Standing in the ruins of Hattusa, Mycenae, or Ugarit today, one can feel both the weight of loss and the persistence of memory. Stones remain, carved with the marks of vanished hands, yet, around them, new societies once grew. The cycle of ruin and renewal is etched into every fragment. The legacy is not one of despair, but of transformation. The collapse ended one world, but it also allowed others to emerge: Phoenician traders, Greek city-states, Israelite villages. Each carried forward something of the old world while creating something new, rooted in endurance. The Sea Peoples themselves may remain mysterious, but their story is woven into the legacy of survival. They were part of the Great Transition, both feared and transformative. leaving behind a memory that still invites us to reflect on the fragility and resilience of human life. As the tale draws to a close, let us rest with the thought that history is never only endings. The quiet legacy of the late Bronze Age collapse is one of survival, adaptation, and rebirth. Empires fell, but humanity endured, carrying its stories forward on waves, in whispers, and in the steady resilience of ordinary lives.